Tonight, you're about to discover one of the most fascinating stories of political survival from the Middle Ages. While Europe debated crusades and chivalry, a young Russian prince learned the impossible art of serving two mortal lords at the same time. And it's this skill that shaped the future of an entire nation. It's worth staying until the end because what he did defies everything we think about honor, loyalty, and leadership. So get comfortable, turn off the lights if you want, and let's go. With the silence after the storm. Novgorod, winter of 1240. The city still breathes with relief, like someone who has just escaped a nightmare and wakes up trembling, sweating, but grateful to be alive. The Mongol hordes that devastated Kiev weeks ago, transforming the most splendid city of Russia into ash and memories, turned back before reaching Novgorod's wooden walls. No one knows exactly why. Some say it was the harsh winter. Others, that the Mongols simply saw no sufficient value in conquering endless forests and frozen swamps. But the truth, as always, is more complex. The Volkhov River is completely frozen now, an ice road that extends like a white scar, cutting the city in half. Upon it, merchants cautiously return to work, their felt boots making muffled sounds on the solid surface. They carry sable and fox furs, amber that glows like solidified honey, real honey in clay jars sealed with wax, and dried fish that will feed the city during the cruelest months. The air is so cold it burns in the lungs, but there's a comforting smell of wood smoke coming from all directions. Every house, every workshop, every tavern burning wood to ward off the deadly cold outside. The streets are narrow and muddy even under the snow, lined with sturdy log houses with roofs covered in frozen moss. Here and there, Orthodox icons gleam golden in windows, small candle flames flickering before them. The sound of the bells of St. Sophia Church echoes through the city at dusk, calling the faithful to evening prayer. And this sound, deep, solemn, comforting, is the constant soundtrack of life in Novgorod. But in the halls of the wooden Kremlin, where the fire crackles softly in a stone fireplace and smoke perfumes the air with notes of pine and birch, young Alexander Yaroslavich knows a truth that few around him perceive. The Mongol's silence is not mercy, it's calculation. It's the pause of a predator assessing its prey before the decisive strike. Alexander is only 20 years old, but his eyes, clear, intense, always observing, have already seen enough to age any man. He saw refugees arrive from Kiev, staggering along snow-covered roads with torn clothes and empty eyes. He heard whispered stories of a city that was the shining jewel of Rus, with its golden domed churches and markets where Greek, Arabic, Scandinavian, and a dozen other languages were spoken, transformed into a field of smoking ruins in a matter of days. He saw the sky darken with smoke from entire cities burned hundreds of kilometers away, as if the earth itself were lamenting. And now, standing before a window covered in intricate ice drawings, natural patterns that look like crystallized forests, rivers frozen in time, winter's very breath captured in glass, he watches the frozen horizon and knows. He knows the storm hasn't passed. It has just changed direction. It's just regrouping. It's just waiting for the right moment. Outside, the Siberian wind howls between the city's wooden watchtowers, making flags snap and gate chains rattle. It's a constant sound, almost hypnotic. This endless howl that seems to come from very far away, crossing thousands of kilometers of open steppe, as if Asia itself were whispering at Europe's door, as if the voice of the Mongols were the wind. And in this tense silence, a question hangs in the cold air of the room. Why did the Mongols stop? The answer isn't on battlefields. It's not in the courage of Russian warriors or in Novgorod's walls. It's in geography, logistics, and above all, in the calculating mind of a conqueror who understands that some territories aren't worth direct conquest. Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis, is not a bloodthirsty savage, as many Europeans like to imagine. He's a strategist, an administrator of an empire stretching from the Pacific to the gates of Europe. Novgorod and its infinite forests of pines and birches, its treacherous swamps that swallow entire armies, its winters that kill horses and men with equal indifference. All this represents a different kind of challenge. It's not that the Mongols can't conquer the north, it's that the cost would be too high. And for what? To control forests? To govern peasants who barely produce agricultural surplus? To maintain garrisons in lands where 6 months of the year are darkness and ice? No. The Mongols learned at that frozen frontier of 1240 that northern Rus wouldn't be subjugated by the sword. It would be controlled through diplomacy, through tribute, through voluntary submission. And Alexander, not yet knowing it, is about to become the greatest diplomat of his age. The man who will understand what few leaders can, that sometimes bowing is the highest form of resistance. But here's the detail that changes everything. The element that transforms this from a survival story into a story of impossible choices. While Alexander contemplates the Mongol threat from the east, while his advisors debate whether to send tribute or prepare defenses, another danger approaches silently. And this one, no one expected. If you're enjoying our stories, subscribe to the channel to help our community grow and receive notifications of new stories. Comment where you're watching from and what time it is. It's fascinating for us to know where our community is around the world. From the west, across the Baltic Sea, beginning to thaw with spring's arrival, white sails with painted black crosses begin to appear. They are the Teutonic Knights and the Livonian Sword Brothers, Christian military orders that combine the religious fanaticism of the Crusades with Prussian military discipline. Warriors who see in the Orthodox lands of Novgorod not allies in the Christian faith, but heretics as dangerous as Muslims, schismatics who need to be corrected by force. For these knights, dressed in white armor with black crosses that reflect the rising sun, the Orthodox faith that Alexander and his people practice is almost as strange as the paganism of the Baltic peoples they are systematically conquering. The Orthodox reject the Pope's authority. They make the sign of the cross backwards, from right to left. Their churches smell of incense and murmurs in Old Slavonic, not Latin. And where there's religious difference in medieval Europe, especially when that difference comes accompanied by fertile lands and lucrative trade routes, there's ready justification for conquest. Alexander finds himself then in a position that would be comical if it weren't absolutely terrifying. To the east, the Mongols, who have just unequivocally demonstrated they can destroy any kingdom, any army, any city they wish. To the west, Crusaders with the moral weight of the Catholic Church, with the Pope's blessing, with a divine mission, ready to save his soul while taking his lands, his ports, his trade routes. Imagine that. You're 20 years old, you govern a rich but small city-state, surrounded by eternal forests and snow for half the year. You don't have a large standing army, just a militia of merchants and artisans who take up arms when necessary. And the two greatest military powers of the known world are literally at your doors. One wants tribute in gold, silver, and political submission. The other wants religious conversion, lands, and spiritual submission. Both have the resources to destroy you completely, and you need to choose. Or rather, and here's the genius that few perceive, you need to find a way not to choose. A way to dance between two empires without being crushed by either. A way to be flexible enough to survive, but strong enough not to disappear. It's at this moment, in this silent winter, transforming into frozen spring of 1240, 1241, that a strategy is born that would shape Russia for the next centuries. A strategy based not on brute military force, which Novgorod simply doesn't possess, but on something much more subtle, something much more complex, something that requires a different kind of courage, the courage to bow to one enemy to be able to face another, the courage to appear weak when you're being strategic, the courage to betray expectations of chivalric honor because your people's survival matters more than your personal reputation. Would you do the same? Would you bow to the Mongol invaders who destroyed Kiev, who burned monasteries, who decimated entire populations, all to gain time and resources to face another enemy? Or would you choose the honor of resistance, the glory of fighting to the end, even knowing with absolute certainty it would mean annihilation, even knowing your city would end up like Kiev, a memory of grandeur transformed into ashes? These aren't easy questions, and Alexander Nevsky will have to answer them not once, but repeatedly throughout his life. This fundamental decision, made in the weeks and months following that winter of 1240, didn't just save Novgorod from destruction. It defined what it would mean to be Russian for the next 1,000 years. The deeply rooted idea that survival is a legitimate form of victory, that flexibility is not weakness but wisdom, that sometimes the greatest act of leadership is not knowing when to fight, but knowing when not to fight, when to bow, when to wait. It's a philosophy that Russians would carry through the centuries, through Mongol domination, through the invasions of Napoleon and Hitler, through all the storms that swept those immense plains, the idea that you can be conquered without being defeated, that you can bow without breaking. And it all begins with news that arrives on a still cold morning in early summer 1240. A messenger enters the wooden Kremlin's hall, muddy feet covered, steaming in the heated air, and says the words that will change everything. "My prince, the Swedes are coming." The Battle of the Neva River. July 1240. Just a few months after the Mongol withdrawal, and the world already seems different. Winter has finally yielded to the brief but intense northern summer, bringing with it the thawing of rivers, the sudden blooming of wildflowers on forest edges, and something no one in Novgorod expected: a Swedish fleet sailing up the Neva River with sails billowing in the sea wind. Summer in northern Rus is an almost magical season. After months of darkness and deadly cold, when the sun finally returns, it barely sets. The White Knights of St. Petersburg, which doesn't yet exist but whose lands are about to be disputed, create an eternal twilight where it's never completely dark. It's as if time itself had slowed down, as if the world were holding its breath before the next inevitable winter. But this particular summer, there's another reason to hold one's breath. The Swedes don't come alone. They bring with them Norwegians with fair hair and icy eyes, Finns who know the forests like no one else, and even some Teutonic Knights, those monastic warriors dressed in white with black crosses who combine vows of chastity with mastery in killing, all united under the banner of the cross and the express blessing of Pope Gregory IX, who sees in this expedition a natural extension of the Crusades. For them, this is a mission as sacred as any expedition to the Holy Land. The Russian Orthodox, after all, are schismatics who separated from the true faith, heretics who need to be brought back to the Catholic flock. And if their lands are conquered in the process, if their lucrative trade routes change hands, well, that's simply divine will manifesting in a convenient way. The leader of this expedition is Birger Jarl, an ambitious Swedish noble who dreams of expanding Swedish influence eastward. He's not just a warrior, he's a statesman, a city builder, a man with vision for the future. But at this moment, His ambition has blinded him to a crucial detail. He's completely underestimating the young prince who governs Novgorod. Alexander receives the news on a clear July morning, when the sun is already high but the air still maintains that freshness of dew. A messenger arrives riding hard, the horse covered in foam, clothes soaked with sweat and river water. He dismounts before the animal even stops completely, runs to the hall where Alexander is meeting with his boyars, and reports, still breathless, the enemy fleet is anchored at the confluence of the Neva and Izhora rivers. He counted at least 20 ships, maybe more. They're setting up camp on the bank, unloading supplies. They seem confident. They sent no formal ultimatum, no demand for surrender. They simply arrived as if they were already owners of those lands. The room explodes in discussion. The boyars, that nobility of wealthy merchants and landowners, men accustomed to debating every decision to exhaustion, immediately begin arguing. Some want to send emissaries to negotiate, others suggest taking refuge behind Novgorod's walls and waiting for the Swedes to tire. Some mention asking the Mongols for help, a bitter irony that makes some laugh nervously. Alexander says nothing. He just listens, observes, thinks. His fingers drum slowly on the massive oak table before him. Outside, through the open windows, he can hear the distant sound of the city. The hammering of a blacksmith, the call of a fish seller, the laughter of children playing near the river. Common sounds, sounds of normal life, sounds that will disappear if he makes the wrong choice. And then he speaks. His voice isn't loud, but it carries that quality that makes people stop talking and listen. We're not going to negotiate. We're not going to wait. We're going to attack. Now! The silence that follows is absolute. Some boyars seem to think they heard wrong. Attack? A well-armed Swedish force with fully armored knights, with bows and spears and papal blessing. With how many men? With what preparation? But here's Alexander's genius, and something that sets him apart from many leaders of his time. He understands that war, especially against a stronger enemy, isn't just about brute force, but about moment, about timing, about finding that perfect instant where the scale of advantage briefly tilts in your favor. The Swedes have just arrived. They're tired from the journey. Sailing upriver is exhausting work. Their horses are being disembarked right now, still unsteady after days at sea. Their armor is probably still packed in campaign chests because no one wears full armor inside a ship. And most importantly, the arrogance of an easy victory has already settled in the camp. They don't expect resistance. They certainly don't expect an attack. It's exactly when they're most vulnerable, exactly when surprise is worth more than numbers. Alexander doesn't elaborate this explanation to the boyars. He doesn't have time to convince them. He simply gives orders, gather all available men, cavalry, infantry, archers. We're not waiting for reinforcements from neighboring villages. There's no time. We leave before nightfall, and something remarkable happens. Despite all the doubts, despite the visible fear on the faces around the table, the men obey. Because there's something about Alexander, even at 20 years old, even without significant military victories on his resume, that inspires confidence. Perhaps it's the calm with which he speaks, perhaps it's the clarity of his vision, or perhaps it's simply that faced with a leader who knows exactly what he wants to do, following seems safer than hesitating. Alexander gathers a force that chronicles estimate at about 1,000 to 1,500 men. It's not an impressive army. They're mainly the druzhina, the prince's personal guard, professional warriors, but limited in number. And Novgorod's militia, composed of merchants, artisans, even some fishermen who traded nets for spears. Men who know how to fight, but aren't career soldiers. Men defending their homes, their families, their way of life. The march to the Neva is done in almost complete silence. Alexander orders no fires to be lit at night. conversations to be in whispers, horses to be led carefully to avoid neighing. They move through the forests like shadows, following ancient hunter trails that only locals know. The surrounding forest is dense and humid, smelling of moss and wet earth. Giant pines rise like columns of a natural cathedral, their highest branches blocking so much sunlight that the forest floor is always in greenish twilight. Fungi grow on fallen trunks, some luminescent varieties that glow softly in the darkness, as if the forest itself were breathing light. The sound of footsteps is muffled by the thick layer of pine needles and dead leaves accumulated over years. Occasionally, a bird lets out a surprised song at seeing this silent column of armed men pass. A deer leaps between trees, white in the twilight, disappearing like a ghost. Alexander rides at the front, young, focused, with that kind of silent determination that doesn't need inflammatory speeches to inspire. He doesn't promise easy victory, doesn't invoke saints or make dramatic oaths, simply rides, and the men behind him feel they're following someone who knows where he's going. At night they stop to rest briefly, but few manage to sleep. The air is charged with tension, that electric anticipation that precedes battle. Men check their weapons for the 10th time. Murmur silent prayers. Some write short messages for families just in case, and hand them to companions. If I don't return, Alexander circulates among them, stopping here and there for a word of encouragement. Not grand speeches, just acknowledgement, a shoulder squeeze, a nod. Small gestures that say, I see you, you matter, we're in this together. Have you ever had to make a decision without time to think? That moment when you can't weigh all the options, consult experts, make lists of pros and cons? When you simply need to trust instinct, feeling, that inner voice that sometimes knows things logic hasn't yet processed? That's exactly what Alexander is doing. And he's about to discover if his instinct was right. July 15th, 1240, dawn. The light is still that indefinite grey that precedes sunrise. The morning mist covers the Neva River like a translucent sheet, floating over the water in layers that move slowly with the breeze. It's so dense you can barely see 10 meters away. The world seems suspended between dream and reality, between night and day. The Swedish camp sleeps peacefully. Here and there a campfire still glows faintly, more ash than flame. Some large ornate tents mark where nobles and knights rest. Guards patrol, but they're relaxed. They yawn. One even sits briefly, rubbing his eyes. After all, who would be crazy enough to attack a well-armed Crusader force, blessed by the Pope, led by experienced nobles? Alexander Yaroslavich, apparently. He raises his hand. The gesture is silent, but everyone around sees it. It's the signal. 1,000 men hold their breath. 1,000 hearts accelerate, and then, with a shout that tears through the mist like lightning, "Za Rus!" for Rus, they attack. What follows isn't a battle in the epic sense. There are no ordered formations, cavalry charges in slow motion, honorable duels. It's pure confusion. It's the brutal force of surprise. It's the chaos of men waking to find enemies already inside the camp, swords already drawn, screams already echoing. The Swedes, caught completely off guard, fight in complete disarray. Knights try to don half-finished armor, hopping on one leg while trying to put on the other greave. Soldiers search for swords that are packed away, shields that are leaning too far away. Some stumble out of tents, still half asleep, not understanding what's happening. The mist makes everything even more confusing. Friend and foe are just indistinct shadows that appear and disappear. Alexander leads by example, not from behind. He's there in the middle of the fight, sword in hand. Later, Russian chronicles will say he personally wounded Birger Jarl in the face with his spear. It's probably an exaggeration, that kind of heroic embellishment that stories accumulate over time. But the important point isn't whether he personally fought the enemy leader, it's that his men saw him fight, saw their prince risking his own life alongside them. And that's worth more than any motivational speech. The battle lasts a few hours, but must have seemed like an eternity for those who were there. The sound is deafening. Steel against steel, command shouts, screams of pain, the frightened neighing of horses. The smell is of sweat, blood, smoke from tents catching fire. And all this time, the mist remains, transforming the fight into something almost surreal, as if it were happening in a dream. When the sun finally burns away the river's mist, that magical moment when the first direct rays evaporate the humidity and the world suddenly becomes visible, the Swedes are in full retreat. Birger Jarl, wounded or not, gives the pragmatic order back to the ships. Now, they board hastily in something bordering on controlled panic. They leave behind still erected tents, supplies, weapons, even some wounded who can't be carried in time. Sails are hoisted with trembling hands and the fleet begins to move downriver, back to the Baltic Sea, back to Sweden. Back to the place where someone will have to explain to the king how an easy conquest turned into humiliating defeat. Alexander lost relatively few men. Russian chronicles, always prone to patriotic exaggeration, say it was only 20. There were probably more, but the point remains. The victory was decisive and the cost was low. The Swedes lost much more than soldiers. They lost momentum, they lost initiative, they lost the narrative, and they lost that fatal confidence that makes commanders underestimate their enemies. The Neva River returns to its tranquil rhythm. The clear water reflects the blue summer sky, now clear of mist. On the banks, birds resume their songs as if nothing had happened. That cheerful chirping that completely ignores human concerns. Dragonflies hover over the water's surface. A gentle breeze makes willow leaves whisper. Nature continues, indifferent. But for humans, everything changed. The march back to Novgorod is completely different from the march there. Now there's conversation, laughter, that euphoric relief of men who survived what they thought would kill them. Stories already begin to form. Did you see when I remember that Swede who... Those narratives that will be retold in taverns for years, growing with each repetition. Novgorod streets receive Alexander as a hero. News of the victory arrived before him, carried by messengers who rode hard. When he enters through the city's main gate, it seems the entire population is there. Children shout his name, throw flowers. Merchants wave from their windows, women cry with relief. Their husbands, sons, brothers returned alive. Even the most skeptical boyars, those who openly doubted his plan, now greet him with new respect. Orthodox priests sing hymns of thanksgiving. Bells ring in all churches. It's a day of spontaneous celebration, the kind no decree can create. Genuine joy, genuine relief, genuine pride. And there, in that moment of celebration, something intangible but crucial happens. Alexander stops being just Yaroslav's son or that young prince. He becomes Nevsky, Alexander of the Neva, the man who defeated the Crusaders at the river, Novgorod's defender, the hero. He's only 20 years old and has just won his first major battle. And for a few hours, he allows himself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, he's found the way to keep his people safe. But Alexander doesn't celebrate for long. While the city feasts, while mead flows freely, while musicians play, while people dance in the streets and briefly forget the fear they've carried for months, he's again before that window of the wooden Kremlin. Only now he's not looking west from where the Swedes came. He looks east, to where the Mongols are, because he knows something that the people, in victory's euphoria, momentarily forget. The Swedes were the lesser problem. An acute, immediate problem, but lesser. A conquest expedition that could be repelled with a decisive battle. The Mongols are something completely different. They're an empire stretching thousands of kilometers. They're hordes that can be repelled but return. They're a force that doesn't accept defeat without retribution. And Alexander has just proven something dangerous. He proved that Novgorod can fight, that it has a capable leader, that it can win against adversity. That's exactly what he didn't want to prove to the Mongols, because now they'll know that Novgorod isn't just another frightened principality waiting to submit. It's a potential challenge, a future threat, something that needs to be dealt with. Curious how a victory can be the beginning of an even bigger problem, isn't it? How sometimes winning a battle means losing something more subtle, more political. Alexander saved Novgorod from the Swedes, but in doing so, he caught the attention of a much more dangerous enemy. And now, standing there at the window watching the east, while behind him the city celebrates, Alexander Nevsky begins to understand the cruel truth of his position. He can't keep winning. At least, not against everyone. Because each victory makes him more visible, more threatening, more worthy of being destroyed. Soon, he'll have to make a choice that goes against everything a warrior is taught to value. He'll have to choose to bow. The price of victory. August 1240. Just a few weeks after the Battle of the Neva, and Novgorod already seems like a different city. There's a new energy in the streets, a pride that didn't exist before. Merchants negotiate with more confidence, artisans work while singing. Even the air seems lighter, as if the city itself had exhaled a breath it had been holding for months. But in the corridors of power, where real decisions are made, the atmosphere is something else entirely. Alexander is discovering a bitter truth that many leaders learn too late. Military victories, however brilliant, don't solve political problems. Sometimes they just create new ones. Novgorod's boyars, that class of wealthy merchants and landowners who technically elect and can remove the prince, have been behaving strangely since the victory. Some treat him with exaggerated, almost servile reverence, which is suspicious coming from men accustomed to negotiating as equals with any authority. Others maintain calculated distance, always observing, like traders evaluating merchandise before making an offer. The problem Alexander is beginning to realize is that he's become too powerful, too quickly. Novgorod isn't a common principality. It's not governed by absolute inheritance, like Kiev or Moscow. It's a merchant republic, where real power lies in the hands of the Vetch, the assembly of free citizens, and the boyars who dominate it. The prince is more of a hired official, a military commander who can be dismissed if he displeases his employers. It's an unusual arrangement in medieval Rus, but it works for Novgorod because it keeps the balance of power fluid, negotiable, until someone like Alexander appears. A prince who not only wins battles, but becomes a popular hero, whose name children shout in the streets, for whom soldiers would die without hesitation. This kind of personal loyalty, this kind of charisma, frightens men accustomed to controlling everything through money and votes. And there's another complication, more subtle but equally dangerous. The victory against the Swedes made Novgorod visible, very visible. And visibility in 13th century Russes surrounded by hungry empires is rarely a good thing. To the west, the Teutonic Knights and the Livonian Order of Sword Brothers are systematically conquering the Baltic lands. These monastic warriors, who combine vows of chastity and poverty with Prussian military expertise, see their mission as a permanent crusade, not just against pagans, but against any form of Christianity that doesn't recognize papal authority. And the Russian Orthodox, with their rejection of the Pope of Rome, with their different rituals, with their Church Slavonic instead of Latin, represent as legitimate a target as any pagan tribe in Prussia. Alexander's victory over the Swedes didn't go unnoticed by these military orders. On the contrary, it identified Novgorod as a potential obstacle to Catholic expansion in the eastern Baltic. And obstacles, in Crusader logic, exist to be removed. On a hot August afternoon, one of those when the brief northern summer sun seems determined to compensate for months of darkness, heating the earth until the smell of pine and resin perfumes all the air, troubling news arrives. Teutonic emissaries have been seen in neighboring cities. Pskov, Novgorod's sister city, is under growing pressure. There's military movement in lands controlled by the Order, preparations, fortifications being reinforced, supplies being accumulated. These are the unmistakable signs of imminent war. Alexander convenes meetings with his closest advisors. The debates are long, tense, loaded with implications that go far beyond military tactics. Because the dilemma Novgorod faces isn't simply military, it's existential. To the east, the Mongols; to the west, Catholic Crusaders. Two empires, two threats, two possible futures, both involving submission in some form. The question isn't whether to bow, but to whom to bow. And here, in the deliberations of those August days, Alexander begins to articulate a strategy that will define not just his reign, but the entire trajectory of Russia for the next centuries. A strategy that modern historians would call realpolitik. Politics based not on ideology or abstract moral principles, but on cold assessment of power and possibility. Alexander's analysis is pragmatic and brutal in its clarity. The Teutonic Knights want total religious conversion. They want to replace orthodoxy with Catholicism. They want subordination to papal authority. They want, essentially, to eliminate Russian cultural identity and replace it with something aligned with Catholic Western Europe. If Novgorod submits to the Crusaders, it will cease to be Russian in any meaningful sense. The Mongols, on the other hand, want tribute. They want recognition of political supremacy. They want gold, silver, soldiers when necessary. But, and this is the crucial detail, they don't care about religion. The Mongol Empire, in its incomprehensible vastness, stretching from China to Hungary, governs dozens of different peoples, dozens of different religions. Buddhists, Muslims, Christians of various denominations, shamanists, Zoroastrians, all coexist under Mongol rule, as long as they pay tribute and don't rebel. For the Mongols, religion is a private matter. For Catholic Crusaders, religion is the central matter. The choice, when put in these terms, becomes less impossible. Novgorod can keep its soul while losing its political freedom. Or it can keep formal freedom while losing its soul. Alexander chooses the first option, but there's an additional component to his strategy, something that demonstrates his political genius. He can't simply submit to the Mongols without resisting. That would seem like pure weakness, and weakness invites more exploitation. He needs to demonstrate selective strength. He needs to show that Novgorod bows not from inability to fight, but from strategic choice. And the Teutonic Knights, conveniently, provide the perfect opportunity for this demonstration. And you, what do you think about this? Leave your opinion in the comments when you have a moment. Russian chronicles of the time, primarily the First Novgorod Chronicle and the Laurentian Chronicle, document that during this period, Alexander began preparing defenses not against the Mongols, but against the Western threat. Fortifications were reinforced, alliances with neighboring principalities were sought, messengers were sent to assess enemy forces and their movements. Simultaneously, there's evidence that Alexander initiated cautious communications with representatives of the Golden Horde, the western arm of the Mongol Empire that controlled the steppes south and east of Rus. These communications were delicate, indirect, full of protocol and symbolism. But the message was clear. Novgorod was willing to recognize Mongol supremacy and pay tribute, in exchange for local autonomy. This decision wasn't popular. Historical records suggest strong opposition among factions of the boyars and clergy. For many, any submission to the pagan Mongols was unacceptable. The memory of destroyed Kiev was still fresh. Pride after the victory over the Swedes made the idea of submission particularly bitter. But Alexander maintained his course. And something remarkable happened. Despite the opposition, despite the doubts, his personal authority, strengthened by the Neva victory, was sufficient to implement the policy. He didn't need to convince everyone. He just needed to maintain enough support to act. Meanwhile, to the west, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Pskov, unable to resist Teutonic pressure alone, ended up submitting. The city accepted the presence of a German garrison and a ruler appointed by the Crusaders. It was a humiliation that reverberated throughout the region and a clear warning to Novgorod, "You're next." The autumn of 1240 arrived with that brutal quickness characteristic of the north. One day the sun still warms, the next the air already has that cutting cold that announces winter. Birch leaves change from green to gold in a matter of weeks, then fall, leaving forests bare and grey. Days shorten dramatically. Darkness begins to dominate. And in the darkness, armies move. Reports arrive with increasing frequency. Teutonic Knights are gathering in Pskov. Estonian forces, Baltic peoples recently converted or conquered, now fighting under Crusader banners, are being mobilized. The Catholic war machine is preparing for its next campaign. The target is obvious: Novgorod, the rich merchant city that refuses to bow to the Pope, that maintains its heretical Orthodox faith, that dared defeat a Swedish Crusader expedition. Novgorod, which needs to learn its place. Alexander receives these reports with apparent calm, but those close to him notice subtle changes. He sleeps less, spends more time consulting maps, studying the region's geography, calculating distances and march times. He's preparing not just to defend but to attack, because he learned something crucial at the Battle of the Neva. He learned that against stronger or equally equipped enemies, victory doesn't come from direct confrontation, but from asymmetry, from doing what the enemy doesn't expect, from fighting at the moment and place you choose, not that they choose. And he's about to put this lesson into practice again in a way that will enter history. But before that, before the battle that will define his legacy, Alexander needs to deal with a more immediate and more dangerous problem than any foreign army. He needs to deal with betrayal, because while he planned military strategies and navigated international politics, while he balanced submission to one empire and resistance to another, some of Novgorod's boyars reached the conclusion that this young, stubborn prince was the problem, not the solution. In secret meetings away from loyal ears, they began discussing alternatives. Some argued for complete submission to the Teutonics. After all, they were Christians at least, even if Catholic. Others simply wanted to remove Alexander and install someone more pliable, more controllable, more willing to obey commercial interests above strategic considerations. The factions within Novgorod, always present but usually contained, began to crystallize around irreconcilable positions. And in merchant city-states, where power is dispersed and constantly negotiated, irreconcilable factions are the prelude to collapse. The crisis was approaching. Not just a military crisis, but a political crisis that threatened to destroy Novgorod from within before any external army had the chance. And Alexander, focused on external threats, still didn't fully perceive the internal danger growing in the shadows. Curious how the dangers we see are rarely the ones that destroy us, isn't it? How sometimes, while we watch the horizon for invading armies, it's the knife in the back that catches us by surprise. The next months would be the most difficult of Alexander's life. Months where he would discover that governing isn't just winning battles, it's navigating betrayals, managing egos, balancing factions, and making decisions where all options are bad, and you need to choose the least worst. It's easy to be a hero on a battlefield. It's much harder to be a leader in a room full of allies who secretly wish for your downfall. And as winter approached, bringing with it both enemy armies and internal conspiracies, Alexander Nevsky was about to face the ultimate test of his leadership. A test that wouldn't be measured in military victories, but in political survival. The hero's exile. Winter of 1241. 6 months after the glorious victory at the Neva, and Alexander Nevsky is no longer in Novgorod. He's in exile. It's one of history's bitterest ironies. The man who saved the city from a Swedish invasion, who became a popular hero practically overnight, who gave Novgorod its first significant victory in years. This man was forced to leave the city by the same boyars who celebrated his victory. What happened in the months between August and December 1240 is documented fragmentarily in Russian chronicles, but enough survives to reconstruct the essential, and what emerges is a story of politics, ego, fear, and that eternal dynamic between charismatic leaders and established elites who fear losing control. The first Novgorod chronicle records laconically, "And there was discord between Prince Alexander and the men of Novgorod, and Alexander departed with his mother and his wife and all his court to Pereyaslavl." Few words to describe a political cataclysm, but in those few words is contained a fundamental transformation. Discord is an aristocratic euphemism. What really happened was a political coup, executed not with swords, but with votes in the Vech, Novgorod's assembly. The boyars, or at least a powerful faction of them, had decided Alexander was a problem. Not because he was incompetent, precisely the opposite, because he was too competent, too popular, too independent, because his military victories gave him a popular support base that threatened the traditional balance of power where the merchant boyars were Novgorod's true rulers. And there was the question of policy regarding the Mongols. Alexander's strategy, submission to the east, resistance to the west, wasn't universally accepted. Some boyars, especially those with commercial connections to the west, with the Hanseatic League and other European merchants, saw more advantage in accommodation with Catholic powers. Some genuinely believed submission to the pagan Mongols was unthinkable for Christians. Others simply used these reasons as pretext to remove a prince they couldn't control. The exact mechanics of the deposition aren't clear. Novgorod had formal procedures for removing princes. It was one of the unique features of this merchant republic, but usually involved specific accusations, public debates, voting. What happened in 1240-1241 seems to have been less formal, accumulated pressure, ultimatums, the implicit threat that if Alexander didn't leave voluntarily, he'd be forced to leave more humiliatingly. And Alexander, calculating the odds, chose to leave, not with dramatic anger or vehement protests, but with that same pragmatic coldness that characterized his military decisions. If Novgorod didn't want him, then Novgorod would be without him, and would bear the consequences. He traveled to Pereyaslavl-Zaleski, a smaller city to the south, part of his family's domains. He took with him his mother, Feodosia, his young wife, Alexandra, and his druzhina, his personal guard, those warriors who were loyal to him personally, not to the city. Some loyal boyars also left, refusing to remain in a Novgorod that had rejected the hero of the Neva. The city was divided, but those who wanted Alexander gone had won, for now. Pereyaslavl in winter is a quiet place, almost forgotten by the world. It lies in a region of deep forests and frozen lakes, far from the great trade routes that make Novgorod rich. The houses are smaller, more humble, The Kremlin is wooden, unimpressive. Life follows ancient rhythms. Fishing in summer, hunting in autumn, survival in winter. For Alexander, accustomed to Novgorod's bustle, it must have been a brutal adjustment. From busy streets full of merchants from a dozen countries, from constant Vesh debates, from the frenetic energy of a commercial city, to silence. Snow. The rustle of pines under the weight of ice. The occasional howl of wolves in distant forests, but silence, sometimes, is exactly what a leader needs. Space to think, to reassess, to plan not the next move, but the next 10 moves. The chronicles don't tell us what Alexander thought during these months of exile. We have no personal letters, diaries, confessions. We have only subsequent actions. But we can infer some things. First, he didn't give up. He could have withdrawn completely from politics, focused on governing his quiet little town, lived a comfortable life away from the dangers and betrayals of high-level politics. But he didn't do that. He kept his druzhina trained. He maintained contacts with allies in Novgorod. He kept informed about political and military developments. He was waiting, but not passively. He was actively waiting, like a chess player who sacrificed a piece but is already 3 moves ahead, seeing patterns others haven't perceived yet. Second, he probably reflected on the limits of military heroism. Victories in battles don't guarantee political loyalty. Popularity with the people doesn't overcome elite opposition if you don't have institutional mechanisms of power. Being loved by the masses and feared by enemies doesn't matter if the men who control the treasury, the laws, and the votes decide you're inconvenient. It's a bitter lesson, but essential for any leader. Power doesn't come only from charisma or competence. It comes from networks, alliances, control of institutions, ability to negotiate and compromise when necessary. Third, and perhaps most importantly, he waited for Novgorod to learn its lesson the hardest way possible, through direct suffering. Because while Alexander was in Pereyaslav, away from power, away from glory, apparently politically defeated, the events he had foreseen were unfolding exactly as he'd anticipated. The Teutonic Knights, interpreting Alexander's expulsion as a sign of internal weakness in Novgorod, intensified their operations. Pskov, already under German control, became a base for increasingly deep incursions into Russian territory. Villages were attacked, fields burned, entire populations fleeing as refugees, and Novgorod, without its most capable military commander, found itself dangerously vulnerable. The boyars who had orchestrated Alexander's departure tried to organize defenses. They appointed other commanders, they gathered militias. But without Alexander's inspiring leadership, without his tactical genius, without the respect soldiers had for him, efforts were disorganized and ineffective. Small skirmishes became defeats, defeats became retreats, territory was lost, and what had been a manageable situation slowly transformed into crisis. Worse still, other Russian principalities, seeing Novgorod weakened and divided, began questioning whether maintaining alliances was worthwhile. If Novgorod couldn't defend itself, why risk Teutonic wrath helping it? Political isolation followed military decline, and both fed the growing fear among Novgorod's population. The chronicles record that in early 1241 delegations began leaving Novgorod toward Pereyaslav. First, unofficial emissaries, then representatives of boyar factions. Finally, an official delegation from the Veche itself. The message was simple, though undoubtedly painful for proud men to convey. Novgorod needed Alexander. The city was in danger. The Teutonics were approaching. There was no more time for pride or politics. It was a matter of survival. They didn't ask that Alexander return. Alexander's response isn't directly recorded, but we can infer it from his actions. He didn't return immediately, didn't come running as soon as they called. He let them wait. Let them feel his absence long enough that the value of his presence became absolutely clear. It wasn't gratuitous cruelty. It was politics. It was establishing once and for all that he wasn't a disposable employee, that his value was recognizable and non-negotiable, that if Novgorod wanted him, it would be on terms that allowed him to actually lead, not just serve, as decorative figure for boyar factions. Finally, in spring 1241, when snow began to melt, when rivers flowed again, when the world awoke from its winter sleep, Alexander Nevsky returned to Novgorod. The streets that had seen him leave months earlier in embarrassed silence now received him with something close to ecstasy. Not because the population had changed their minds. The people had never wanted him to leave, but because now even the most skeptical boyars publicly recognized they had lost him and that his absence had nearly cost Novgorod's existence. But Alexander didn't return as triumphant hero. He returned as hardened leader, someone who had learned that military victories are only part of the equation, that politics is as important as battle, that sometimes, paradoxically, you gain more power by being expelled and then called back than if you had never left. He had departed as a young prince who had won a battle. He returned as a statesman who understood power games, and he arrived with a plan. Not just to defeat the Teutonic Knights, that was a given, but to do it in a way that would consolidate his power permanently, that would make it impossible for boyars to question him again, that would establish a legacy lasting centuries. The first order of business was military. Pskov needed to be liberated. The Teutonics needed to be expelled. But this time, Alexander wasn't interested in just tactical victory. He was planning something bigger. He was planning a statement, a demonstration of power so unequivocal, so overwhelming, that it would resonate throughout all Ruses and beyond. Something that would make the Mongols to the east pay attention and recognize that this principality, though willing to pay tribute, wasn't weak. Something that would make the Crusaders to the west rethink the wisdom of provoking this northern bear. He was planning the Battle of Lake Peipus, the battle that would enter history as the battle on the ice. But before that, there was work to do, troops to gather, alliances to form, intelligence to collect, and, more subtly, a narrative to build. Have you ever noticed how sometimes our moments of greatest weakness, when we're knocked down, rejected, exiled, can become foundations for our greatest triumph? How Alexander's forced exile ended up being exactly what he needed to transform from military commander into complete leader. Alexander's return to Novgorod in spring 1241 marks a turning point, not just in his own story, but in Russia's history. Because the man who returned wasn't the same one who had left. He was someone who understood not just how to win wars, but how to navigate politics, how to balance factions, how to transform necessity into opportunity. And he was about to demonstrate these skills in a way that would echo through the centuries. The liberation of Pskov. Spring 1241. The thaw has arrived not just to the land, but to the political situation. Alexander is back in Novgorod, but there's no time for prolonged celebrations or sentimental reconciliations. The crisis is immediate and existential. Pskov, Novgorod's sister city, has been under German occupation for months. The Teutonic Knights installed a permanent garrison, replaced local authorities with German administrators, and are using the city as a base for increasingly deep incursions into Russian territory. Villages along the border have been looted. Refugees arrive daily in Novgorod with stories of burned homes, confiscated harvests, dispersed families. The Crusaders' message is clear: submit or be destroyed. Convert to Catholicism or lose everything. This isn't diplomacy. It's conquest in progress. Alexander assesses the situation with that same calculating coldness that characterizes him. Pskov cannot remain in enemy hands, not just for strategic reasons, though these are sufficient, since the city controls vital trade routes and serves as barrier between Novgorod and Teutonic-controlled lands, but also for symbolic reasons. If Pskov, one of the principal cities of Rus, can be conquered and held without effective response, then all other cities know they're vulnerable. The perception of weakness becomes self-fulfilling prophecy. Additionally, there's the practical aspect of his own political position. Alexander returned to Novgorod not through boyar charity, but through their necessity. This necessity is his leverage of power, but only while he can demonstrate continuous value. A decisive victory would consolidate his position in a way internal politics couldn't easily destabilize again. So, Pskov must be liberated. The question isn't if, but how. The chronicles record that Alexander spent the first weeks after his return in meticulous preparation. This wasn't the spontaneous, bold attack of the Neva. It was carefully planned campaign, taking into account not just military tactics, but logistics, intelligence, and even diplomacy. First, troops. Alexander's druzhina, his personal guard of professional warriors, was a reliable corps but too small for large-scale campaign. He needed Novgorod's militia, those merchants and artisans who took up arms when necessary, but he also needed reinforcements from other principalities. He sent messengers to his younger brother Andrei, who governed other family lands. The response was positive. Andrei would come with his own forces. It was both family and political alliance, but valuable either way. The combined numbers would give Alexander a force sufficient not just to liberate Pskov, but to face the Teutonics in open field if necessary. Second, intelligence. Alexander needed to know exactly what forces were garrisoning Pskov, how the city was fortified, where the weaknesses in defenses were. Spies were sent. Probably merchants who could travel without arousing suspicion, perhaps even some Pskov residents who had escaped and now provided detailed information. What these reports revealed was both encouraging and concerning. The Teutonic garrison in Pskov wasn't huge, perhaps a few dozen knights plus Estonian auxiliary forces, but the city was fortified, and fully armoured knights behind walls were notoriously difficult to dislodge. A prolonged siege was possible, but not ideal. Winter was ending, but it was still cold enough that maintaining an army in the field for weeks would be logistically challenging. Speed would be essential, a quick, decisive attack that took the city before reinforcements could arrive from more distant Teutonic bases. Third, narrative. This is an aspect historians sometimes neglect, but effective leaders always understand. Wars aren't won only on battlefields. They're won in people's minds, your own troops, the civilian population, potential allies, and even enemies. Alexander was building a narrative of liberation. Pskov wasn't being attacked, it was being liberated. The Russian population under German occupation weren't enemies to be conquered, but compatriots to be saved. The Teutonic Knights weren't just military adversaries, but foreign invaders who had violated Russian lands and needed to be expelled. This narrative served multiple purposes. It motivated his own troops. They were fighting not for a prince's ambition, but for the liberation of Russian cities. It potentially encouraged internal resistance in Pskov. If the population saw Alexander as liberator, not conqueror, they might actively help or at least not resist. And it established moral justification that even neutral observers would recognize as legitimate. Stay with me until the end, because what comes next is a fascinating part of this journey. In March 1241, when the last ice began to yield and roads became minimally passable, Alexander marched. The army that left Novgorod was substantially larger than the force with which he had attacked the Swedes at the Neva. Estimates vary. Medieval chronicles are notoriously unreliable for numbers, but probably involved a few thousand men. Alexander's Druzhina, heavy cavalry in Russian style, not as heavily armored as Western knights but more mobile. Novgorod's infantry, men with spears, axes, bows, his brother Andrei's forces, and possibly contingents from other smaller principalities that saw opportunity to weaken the Teutonics. The march to Pskov took days. It wasn't a great distance in a straight line, but medieval roads, especially in the transition between winter and spring, when Thor transforms everything into mud, made travel slow and grueling. Wagons got stuck, horses slipped. Men marched through mud that reached their ankles, then their knees in some especially bad sections. But there was determination in the army that hadn't existed in the disorganized expeditions the boyars had tried to mount during Alexander's absence. There was sense of purpose. And there was confidence in the commander. That intangible but crucial confidence that makes soldiers continue even when they're tired, wet, miserable. They arrived at Pskov in early April. The city, seen from a distance through the last winter mists, was a familiar but strange sight. The same wooden and stone walls, the same churches with onion-shaped domes, the same sloping roofs. But something was different. There were foreign banners on the towers, guards with armor that reflected differently. Western style, not Russian. The city looked the same but had been transformed, occupied, possessed. Alexander didn't attack immediately. He established siege, surrounding the city, cutting supply and communication routes. It was both military and psychological tactic. It gave the garrison time to consider their position. Isolated, surrounded by superior force, with no realistic hope of timely relief. The chronicles suggest there were negotiation attempts. Probably ultimatums were sent: leave the city or face assault. Messages were passed to Russian residents inside the city, encouraging them not to resist when the attack came, promising that Alexander came as liberator, not conqueror. The Teutonic response isn't recorded in detail, but their actions speak clearly. They didn't surrender. Knights were trained from childhood never to retreat, never to surrender. Their monastic orders emphasized honorable death over shameful capitulation. And strategically, surrendering Pskov without a fight would establish terrible precedent. Other occupied cities would expect the same, and the entire Baltic conquest project could begin to unravel. So there would be battle. The assault on Pskov began on a cold April morning. Mist still covered the Velikaya River that runs beside the city, creating that surreal atmosphere that seems characteristic of Alexander's battles, as if nature itself were adding dramatic theatricality to events. The specific details of the assault are scarce in the chronicles. We know it involved attack on the city's defenses, that there was fighting on the walls, that eventually Alexander's forces penetrated the defenses and entered the city. But the precise narrative, which gates were attacked, what specific tactics were used, how long it took, is lost in history's mist. What we know is the result. The Teutonic garrison was defeated. Some knights were killed in the fighting. Others, the chronicles specifically mention 2 German voivodes, were captured. The German-installed ruler was removed. Russian administration was restored. And critically, the civilian population wasn't harmed. This is a significant detail the chronicles make a point of mentioning. There was no widespread looting, no massacre of collaborators, no bloody revenge. Alexander controlled his troops, never an easy task after victory in battle, when emotions are high and discipline tends to dissolve. This wasn't abstract kindness, it was calculated politics. Alexander needed Pskov to see its liberation as positive, not just exchange of one occupier for another. He needed other cities under Teutonic pressure to know that alignment with Novgorod brought protection, not exploitation. He was building coalition, not empire. The liberation of Pskov had immediate and wide repercussions. Militarily, It removed the main Teutonic base in Russian territory. It forced the knights to retreat to their own lands, to the Baltic cities they had conquered from pagan tribes. It shifted the war's momentum, from Teutonic offensive pushing eastward to defensive trying to hold what they had. Politically, it restored Novgorod's prestige. Other Russian cities that had begun questioning whether Novgorod was still a significant power now had clear answer. Alliances that had begun to fray were reinforced. Messengers from smaller principalities appeared, seeking coordination, offering support. And personally, it consolidated Alexander's position. The boyars who had forced him into exile now had no basis to question his leadership. He had done exactly what he said he would do. He had demonstrated he was indispensable. The balance of power in Novgorod had permanently shifted. Not that Alexander was now an autocrat, the city's republican structure remained, but that his voice carried weight that couldn't be ignored. But Alexander knew liberating Pskov was only the first step. The Teutonic Knights wouldn't accept this defeat passively. They would already be gathering forces, planning response, preparing counter-offensive. The war was far from over, and indeed, intelligence reports began arriving. Large concentrations of Teutonic Knights were being seen near the border. Auxiliary troops, Danes, Estonians, other allied forces, were being mobilized, supplies being accumulated, weapons being prepared. The Crusaders were planning something big, not a raid or limited operation, but large-scale campaign designed to crush Novgorod once and for all, to avenge Pskov, to establish Catholic dominion over the entire region. And Alexander, analyzing the reports, making his own calculations, looking at maps and considering terrain and season and logistics, began formulating a plan. He wouldn't wait to be attacked. He wouldn't take refuge behind Novgorod's walls and wait for the enemy to come to him. He had learned at the Neva that initiative is crucial advantage, that choosing the battlefield is halfway to winning the battle. He would go meet the Teutonics, but on terrain of his choosing, at a moment of his choosing, in circumstances so perfectly arranged that victory would be not just possible, but probable. He was planning to lure them to Lake Peipus, to that vast expanse of water that at this time of year was still frozen but beginning to weaken, to terrain where heavy cavalry and the main Teutonic advantage would become disadvantage, where local knowledge of ice conditions would give the Russians decisive advantage. He was planning the battle that would be remembered for centuries, the battle on the ice. But planning is one thing, execution is another. And between April 1241 and the final confrontation, there was still much work to do. Troops to prepare, allies to coordinate, and more subtly, an enemy to provoke, to lure, to manipulate into doing exactly what Alexander wanted them to do. The military chess was entering its final phase. The pieces were positioned, the trap was being prepared. Now it was just a matter of making the adversary move to exactly where Alexander wanted them to be. And the Teutonic Knights, confident in their military superiority, in their superior armor, in their superior training, in their faith that God was on their side, marched directly into the trap. The chessboard of ice. April 1241. Spring in northern Russia is a season of contradictions. The sun gains strength, warming the air during the day until it's almost comfortable, but at night, temperatures still drop below zero. Snow melts in irregular patches, creating landscapes of white and brown, beauty and mud. Rivers begin to flow again, but with chunks of ice still floating in the current. And the lakes, those vast expanses of water that dominate the region's geography, remain frozen, but not solidly. The ice is weakening, becoming treacherous, unpredictable. It's exactly this transitional moment, this narrow window between full winter and true spring that Alexander is counting on for his strategy. After liberating Pskov, he didn't immediately return to Novgorod. He established temporary base nearby, keeping his army mobilized, waiting, not passively but like a predator who has already chosen where to ambush and now just awaits the prey to arrive. Intelligence reports arrive regularly. The Teutonic Knights are gathering their forces in Dorpat, one of their main fortresses in the conquered Baltic lands. Not just knights from the Teutonic Order itself, but also from the Livonian Order of Sword Brothers, plus Danes, who controlled territories to the north, plus Estonian auxiliary troops recently converted or subjugated. It's a formidable coalition, representing the combined power of Catholic expansion in the Baltic. Estimates of numbers vary wildly. Medieval chronicles are rarely precise about army sizes, and both sides had reasons to exaggerate or minimize depending on the narrative they wanted to build. The Germans would later say they were outnumbered, justifying defeat. The Russians would say they faced impossible odds, magnifying victory. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. What we know with reasonable certainty is that the Teutonic force included substantial numbers of fully armored knights. Perhaps between 40 and 60 true knights, each a fortress of metal on warhorse, plus squires and men-at-arms. Together with auxiliary forces, the total army probably numbered in the 1,000 to 2,000 men range. Alexander's forces were comparable in size, possibly slightly larger. But there was crucial difference in composition. The Russians had less heavy cavalry, more light cavalry and infantry. Their armor was generally less complete than the Teutonic Knights. On open, flat battlefield in direct confrontation, advantages would probably favor the Crusaders. Alexander wasn't planning to give them that battlefield. He had chosen Lake Peipus as ideal location for several converging reasons. First, geography. The lake is vast, about 3,500 square kilometers in area, one of Europe's largest. In April, it's still frozen, but the ice is beginning to deteriorate, especially in deeper areas and at edges. Someone who knows the lake intimately, local fishermen, residents who crossed its ice all winter, can identify where ice is solid and where it's beginning to weaken. Foreigners wouldn't have this knowledge. Second, tactics. Ice offers perfect flat surface that cavalry would normally love. No obstacles, no trees, perfect for charges. But ice is also surface that offers no firm traction. Horses slip, men fall, and knights in full armor, weighing perhaps 100–150 kilograms with equipment, exert tremendous pressure on the ice beneath them. If the ice breaks, third, psychology. The Teutonic Knights weren't just soldiers, they were ideologues. They were crusaders who genuinely believed God was on their side, that their causes were just, that courage and faith would overcome adversity. This mentality created formidable warriors willing to die for their beliefs, but it also created certain strategic arrogance, certain reluctance to retreat or avoid battle. If Alexander could provoke them to attack on terrain of his choosing, they probably would, confident in their superiority. So the plan was simple in concept, complex in execution. Lure the Teutonics onto the lake to an area where Alexander knew the ice was weakening, and then use tactics that maximized Russian advantages while denying enemy advantages. But first, he needed to ensure they actually came to where he wanted. Alexander began a series of calculated provocations. Incursions into Teutonic-controlled territory, attacks on villages and outposts, not permanent conquests. He didn't have resources to hold these positions, but raids designed to cause damage, capture supplies, and mainly enrage the enemy. Each incursion came with reports filtered back to Teutonic commanders, exaggerating Russian weakness, suggesting disorganization, implying Alexander was overextended and vulnerable. The subliminal message was clear: come now while you have advantage before he strengthens further. It was bait, and it worked. The chronicles, both Russian and German, agree that in early April 1241 the Teutonic army marched from Dorpat toward Russian territory. They weren't moving defensively or cautiously, they were advancing with clear intent to force decisive battle, to crush Alexander once and for all, to avenge Pskov and establish permanent dominion over the region. They crossed into Russian territory and began advancing toward Lake Peipus, following reports that Alexander's forces were operating in that area. Alexander, informed of their movements by network of scouts and spies, began final choreography. He positioned his army near the lake's eastern shore, in area where terrain behind him was firm, but ice ahead was increasingly doubtful. He sent smaller forces to make contact with the advancing enemy, to skirmish and then retreat, drawing them forward. It's the classic move of military history, strategic retreat that looks like weakness, but is really preparation. Make the enemy pursue, make them think they're winning, lead them where you want them to be. The Teutonics pursued. April 5th, 1241. The sky is grey, loaded with those low clouds that seem to touch the treetops. The air has that humid, cold quality that penetrates layers of clothing and reaches bones. There's smell of melting snow, of wet earth, of something changing. The season, the climate, history. The Teutonic army arrives at Lake Peipus's western shore. On the other side, perhaps a kilometer or more away across the ice, they can see Russian forces formed in battle line. It's a tempting sight of the enemy, apparently ready to fight, but in position that seems defensive, almost passive. There was debate among Teutonic commanders. Some more cautious advisors argued for prudence. April is dangerous month to fight on frozen lakes. Better to wait, force Alexander to come to them on solid ground, or simply besiege and force surrender without risk of pitched battle. But others, especially the younger ones, the most ideologically committed, those who saw each battle as test of faith, argued for immediate action. The enemy is there. Victory is within reach. God is with the righteous. Advance, the decision was to advance. It's easy, centuries later, to judge this choice as obvious error. But placed in the context of the time, it made reasonable sense. Ice in April was still generally reliable for crossing, especially in the shallow lakes characterizing the region. Heavy cavalry had fought on frozen lakes before without incident, and strategically allowing Alexander to choose time and place of battle indefinitely wasn't a viable option. So they advanced onto the ice. The knights went first, when it was always thus, knights at front. They were elite, the spearhead, the symbol of everything the order represented. Behind them, auxiliary infantry, less prestigious but numerous. The Teutonic formation was classic, heavy wedge, design intended to break enemy lines through pure momentum and weight. Dozens of fully armored knights in tight formation, war horses trained not to retreat, long lances ready to charge. It's formation that had crushed pagan armies throughout Prussia and the Baltic. There was no reason to think it wouldn't work against the Russians. Alexander watched them come. His own forces were arranged not in single solid line, but in more flexible formation. Infantry in center, but not deeply packed. Cavalry on flanks ready to maneuver. Archers scattered, ready to fire and retreat. It wasn't formation designed to withstand direct charge through pure resistance. It was formation designed to absorb, deflect, and then counterattack from unexpected angles. As the Teutonics approached, the sound of hundreds of hooves on ice echoing strangely across the lake, amplified by the peculiar acoustics of that vast open expanse, Alexander kept his troops steady. He didn't advance to meet them in the lake's middle. He stayed near shore where he knew ice was stronger, where there was solid ground to retreat to if necessary. He was letting the Teutonics come to him across increasingly doubtful ice, exerting pressure on surface that was beginning to fail. The distance closed, 500 meters, 300, 200? The Teutonic Knights accelerated to full charge, that terrifying moment in medieval battle when several tons of armored horses and armored men move in tight formation, deafening sound, earth, or in this case, ice, shaking under impact. And then, just dozens of meters before impact, Alexander gave the signal. The Russian lines opened. They didn't break or flee, but deliberately created gaps, allowing the Teutonic wedge formation to pass through instead of colliding with solid resistance. It's extremely difficult maneuver requiring tremendous discipline. Every soldier's instinct facing cavalry charges to form closed line, present solid front. Deliberately opening lines goes against all basic training, but it works. The Teutonic wedge, instead of crushing Russian line, penetrates through it but loses cohesion in the process. The knights find themselves surrounded with enemies on all sides, their carefully organized formation now fragmented, and then the Russian cavalry, which had been waiting on the flanks, attacked from the sides. The Battle on the Ice, April 5th, 1241, Lake Peipus. The moment Alexander had been planning for weeks has finally arrived, and it's unfolding exactly as he anticipated. The Teutonic wedge formation penetrated through the Russian lines, but in the process lost its deadly cohesion. The knights, who had been unified and concentrated force, are now scattered, surrounded, fighting as individuals instead of coordinated military machine. And it's exactly at this moment of maximum confusion that the Russian cavalry attacks from the flanks. The sound of battle on ice is peculiar, different from combat on solid ground. There's no dust being raised, there's no muffled sound of hooves on earth. Instead, there's strange clarity. The metallic echo of weapons clashing amplified by the hard ice surface, the sharp neighing of horses slipping, the cry of men fighting not just against enemies, but against the very terrain that constantly threatens to knock them down. The Teutonic Knights are formidable warriors. Even surrounded, even on unfavorable terrain, they fight with brutal competence that comes from years of training and battle experience. Their complete armor, metal plates covering practically the entire body, makes them difficult to kill. Russian arrows fired by archers who constantly maneuver to maintain distance ricochet or penetrate only superficially. Spears break against tempered steel. Even direct blows from axe or sword often only dent armor without causing real injury. But armor that is strength in some contexts becomes weakness in others. On ice, weight is critical disadvantage. Knights weighing 100–150 kilograms with complete equipment exert concentrated pressure on surface that's beginning to fail, and when horse slips or stumbles, which happens constantly on this treacherous surface, knight in full armor can't get up easily, requires help or minutes of exhausting struggle just to stand again. The Russians, with lighter armor, many wearing only chainmail and helmets, without the complete plates of Western knights, have mobility the Teutonics don't possess. They can move more quickly, they can recover balance more easily when they slip, and crucially they know how to read the ice. They know the signs of where it's strong and where it's weak, knowledge that comes from living in region where frozen rivers and lakes are part of life for half the year. The battle fragments into dozens of smaller confrontations. There are no clear lines, no defined fronts. It's controlled chaos, if it can be called controlled. Small groups of Teutonic knights fight back to back, trying to maintain defensive formations while being attacked from all directions. Russian infantry approaches with long spears, looking for the few vulnerable points in armor. Armpits, groin, throat where joints between plates leave small openings, and then, inevitably, the ice begins to give way. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in spots, in areas where concentrated weight and constant movement finally exceed what the weakened surface can support. There's cracking, that dry, terrifying sound of ice breaking, followed by water surging through cracks. The first knight who falls through the ice probably doesn't immediately realize what's happening. There's sudden downward movement, freezing water exploding around, the shock of cold that literally takes breath away. Water at a few degrees above zero provokes immediate physiological response: hyperventilation, loss of fine motor control, panic. And a man in full armor who falls into deep water doesn't float, he sinks. The chronicles, both Russian and some later German sources, specifically mention knights sinking through the ice. There's debate among historians about how many actually died this way versus how many were killed in direct combat, but it's clear that breaking ice was a significant factor. The sound of ice breaking, the scream of men falling into freezing water, has profound psychological effect on the rest of the battle. Suddenly, it's not just matter of fighting enemies, it's matter of fighting the very terrain that can open and swallow you at any moment. Those still on solid ice begin to retreat, moving more cautiously, much more concerned with where they step than where the enemy is. This moment, when fear of terrain overcomes fear of enemy, marks the psychological turning point of the battle. The Teutonic formation, already fragmented, now begins to completely disintegrate. Some groups try to fight in orderly retreat back to the lake's western shore. Others, surrounded too deeply, try to surrender. But surrender in medieval battle is complicated matter. There are no Geneva Conventions, no agreed procedures, and when battle is in progress, when adrenaline is high, when the line between killing or being killed is measured in fractions of seconds, stopping to accept surrender is dangerous luxury many soldiers can't or won't take. Some knights are captured. The chronicles specifically mention prisoners, including high-ranking commanders, but many others are simply killed where they stand, surrounded, exhausted, unable to continue fighting, but also unable to escape. The battle lasts, depending on which chronicle you read, between 2 and 4 hours. It doesn't seem like much time when told like that, but for those who were there, it must have seemed like eternity. Hours of extreme tension, brutal physical effort, constant fear, penetrating cold. Even the victors end exhausted, shaking as much from cold as from adrenaline discharge. When it finally ends, when the last surviving Teutonics manage to retreat across the lake, back to land controlled by them, when Russian troops stop pursuing and begin gathering wounded and counting dead, the scene that remains is something witnesses would remember for the rest of their lives. The ice of Lake Peipus is stained red in irregular patches. Bodies, both men and horses, are scattered across area of perhaps a square kilometre. Some ice areas are broken, revealing dark water below. Discarded equipment is everywhere: cracked shields, broken spears, lost swords, pieces of armor torn off in desperate struggle. And there's silence. After hours of deafening noise, the silence that follows battle's end is almost physical in its intensity. Only the sound of wind over the lake, the occasional moan of wounded, the rustling of men moving slowly, too exhausted to speak. If you're enjoying this journey, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next stories. Casualty estimates vary enormously. Russian chronicles, naturally inclined to patriotic exaggeration, speak of hundreds of knights killed. Later, German sources minimize losses. Historical truth is probably that between 20 and 50 Teutonic knights died, a number that may not seem huge until you consider that knights were tiny elite and extremely expensive to train and equip. Losing 50 knights in single battle was significant strategic disaster for the orders. Russian casualties were probably comparable or even higher in absolute numbers, but composition mattered. Losing infantry soldiers, though tragic, was easier to replace than losing elite knights. And crucially, Alexander won. And in medieval politics and perception, victory transformed even heavy casualties into heroic sacrifice, while defeat transformed even small losses into humiliation. More significant than numbers killed were numbers captured. The chronicles specifically mention that 50 knights were taken prisoner back to Novgorod. This wasn't just military victory, it was political statement. These prisoners would be paraded through Novgorod streets, visual demonstration that invincible Crusaders had been defeated, that Alexander had protected the city, that Russian power wasn't something to be underestimated. News of victory spread quickly. Messengers were sent back to Novgorod before the battlefield was even completely cleared. And when they arrived, carrying reports of overwhelming victory, of defeated and captured Crusader knights, of temporarily destroyed Teutonic threat, the reaction was euphoric. Novgorod exploded in spontaneous celebration. Bells rang in all churches. People took to the streets despite continued cold. Mead and beer flowed freely. It was celebration that mixed genuine relief. The threat that had terrorized the city for months was neutralized with patriotic pride and religious fervor. Because this wasn't seen as just military victory, it was seen as victory of Orthodox faith over Catholic heresy, as divine validation. The fact that it occurred near Easter, though exact dates are debated due to differences between Julian and Gregorian calendars, was interpreted as sign of special blessing. Alexander returned to Novgorod not immediately, but a few days later, giving time for news to spread, for anticipation to build. When he finally entered the city, it was with Teutonic prisoners marching ahead, proud knights now disarmed, defeated, living symbols of Russian victory. It was theater as much as politics. It was consolidation of power through visual spectacle. And it worked perfectly. Alexander's position in Novgorod, which had been questioned just months before, was now absolutely consolidated. There would be no more talk of exiling him. There would be no more boyars conspiring to replace him. He had demonstrated in a way even the most skeptical couldn't deny that he was indispensable. But Alexander, even amid triumph, was thinking beyond immediate celebration. He was thinking about long-term implications, about reactions this victory would provoke, about next moves in the great political game governing Russ's survival. Victory over the Teutonics solved the Western threat. But it made the Eastern situation more complicated, because the Mongols were watching, and now they had seen that this small northern principality wasn't powerless, that it had capable prince, that it could win battles against formidable adversaries. This could be interpreted two ways, either as sign that Novgorod would be a valuable partner, strong enough to be useful, worthy of degree of autonomy, or as potential threat, too strong for comfort, something that needed to be more firmly controlled. Everything would depend on how Alexander navigated the next steps, on how he presented victory not as challenge to Mongol power, but as demonstration of value, on how he continued walking that impossible line between showing enough strength to be respected, but not so much that he was seen as threat. It was the dilemma that would define the rest of his life. And it was just beginning. For now, though, there was victory to savor. There was city to govern. There were wounded to treat and dead to bury, and prisoners to eventually negotiate for ransom. There was normal life that needs to continue even after extraordinary moments pass. The ice of Lake Peipus would completely melt in a few weeks. True spring would arrive. And where there had been battle, soon there would be only water again, as if nothing had happened. But memory would persist. The battle on the ice would enter Russian history as one of the defining moments, one of the stories that would be told and retold through centuries. It would be romanticized, mythologized, transformed into symbol of Russian resistance against Western invaders, And Alexander Nevsky, the young prince in his early 20s who had already won 2 decisive battles, would be remembered not just as military commander, but as savior of Russia. But he didn't know that yet. He didn't yet know he would be canonized as saint. He didn't yet know his name would be invoked by Russian leaders through the centuries, from Ivan the Terrible to Stalin, whenever they needed symbol of national defense. At that moment, in April 1241, he was just a tired man after difficult battle, satisfied with victory, but conscious that the larger game was far from over. And the next move in that game would be the most difficult of all. It would be traveling east, to Mongol lands, to bow before the Khan and negotiate the terms of Novgorod's survival. The journey to the east. Summer 1241. 3 months after the battle on the ice, and Immerse is still processing the repercussions. Alexander's victory resonated far beyond Novgorod's borders. Messengers carried news to all Russian principalities, from Suzdal to Vladimir, from Rostov to Ryazan, in cities that had been burned by the Mongols, in villages living under constant threat of new invasions, in monasteries where monks copied chronicles and prayed for their world's survival. The story of the battle on the ice brought something rare and precious. Hope. Hope that resistance was possible, that invaders, whether Mongols, Crusaders, or any others, weren't invincible, that Rus, fragmented and weakened as it was, still had leaders capable of defending their people. But Alexander doesn't completely share this optimism. He sees the situation with colder, more pragmatic clarity. Victory over the Teutonic Knights solved one problem, but potentially aggravated another, because the Mongols were watching, and now they needed to decide how to interpret what they saw. News of Alexander's victory inevitably reached the Golden Horde, the Mongol Khanate controlling the steppes south and east of Rus. Batu Khan, ruler of that vast territory, grandson of Genghis Khan and one of the most powerful men in the medieval world, now had interesting information to consider. A Russian principality had defeated a significant Crusader force. This demonstrated military capability. It demonstrated competent leadership. But it also raised a question: would this capability be used only defensively, or could it eventually be turned against Mongol dominion? For most Russian principalities, the question of relations with the Mongols was already resolved by force. Kiev had been destroyed, Vladimir had been sacked, dozens of smaller cities had been burned. The message was clear: submit or be annihilated. And most had chosen submission, paying regular tribute, sending princes to pay homage to the Khan, accepting Mongol oversight. But Novgorod, by peculiarity of its geography and timing of the Mongol invasion, had escaped direct conquest. The Mongols had stopped before reaching it. And now, with Alexander demonstrating significant military strength, the situation needed to be formalized one way or another. Alexander understood this perfectly. He understood that victory over the Teutonics, though necessary and beneficial in the short term, had made urgent the need to establish clear relations with the Golden Horde. He couldn't simply ignore Mongol power and hope they'd ignore him. He had to act proactively, had to control the narrative, had to present himself not as potential threat, but as voluntary and valuable vassal. So, in summer 1241, Alexander made the decision that would define not just his own fate, but that of all Russia for the next centuries. He decided to travel voluntarily eastward, to meet with Batu Khan, to negotiate the terms of Novgorod's submission to Mongol power. The decision wasn't popular. There were factions in Novgorod, especially among the more fervent Orthodox clergy, who saw any recognition of Mongol power as betrayal of Christian faith. The Mongols were pagans, though in reality they practiced a type of open, tolerant shamanism for multiple religions. Bowing to them, paying them tribute, recognizing their authority, seemed to some a spiritual abomination. But Alexander, in meetings with boyars and religious leaders, argued from brutal pragmatism. The alternative to negotiated submission was forced submission, preceded by destruction. Kiev had tried to resist. Where was Kiev now? Vladimir had tried to resist. How long did it last before its walls were torn down and its churches burned? The choice wasn't between freedom and submission. It was between submission that preserved essential structures of Russian life, Orthodox faith, local institutions, cultural continuity, and destruction that would eliminate everything. Put in these terms, opposition diminished. It didn't disappear completely, it never does in such fundamental matters, but was sufficiently contained for Alexander to proceed. Preparation for the journey took weeks. It wasn't simply a matter of Alexander riding eastward. He needed appropriate retinue, large enough to demonstrate importance and seriousness, but not so large it seemed threatening. He needed gifts. Mongol protocol required visitors bring tributes, and the quality of these gifts communicated messages about status and intentions. He needed interpreters, since Alexander didn't speak Mongol, and needed to ensure his message was accurately transmitted, and he needed courage, because he was voluntarily placing himself at the mercy of one of the most powerful and brutal empires the world had ever seen. If Batu Khan decided Alexander was a threat, or simply wanted to make an example, there was nothing that could protect him. He'd be completely vulnerable, but this vulnerability was part of the point. It was demonstration of good faith. It was communicating, through actions more eloquent than words, that Novgorod had no hostile intentions, that it recognized the reality of Mongol power, that it sought accommodation, not conflict. The journey began in midsummer. Alexander departed Novgorod with retinue of perhaps 50 to 100 people, selected boyars who would serve as witnesses and advisors, warriors from his druzhina functioning both as honor guard and practical protection, servants and assistants necessary for long travel, and the essential interpreters and guides who knew routes and customs. The first part of the journey crossed lands still nominally Russian, though many already paid tribute to the Mongols. Cities that had been prosperous just a few years before now showed scars of invasion, partially rebuilt walls, entire neighborhoods still in ruins, diminished populations. It was a constant reminder of what happened when one resisted Mongol power without sufficient force to win. But there was also something more subtle. There was adaptation. Life continuing despite catastrophe. People rebuilding homes, markets functioning again, children playing in streets. Human resilience is remarkable. Even after near total destruction, people find ways to continue, to rebuild, to keep traditions and hopes alive. As they traveled further south and east, entering the vast steppes that were traditional Mongol territory, the landscape changed dramatically. The dense northern forests gradually gave way to open plains, stretching to the horizon in all directions. Trees became rare, then disappeared completely. The sky seemed much larger here, without trees blocking view, extending in infinite blue dome from horizon to horizon. This was territory unlike anything Alexander knew. There were no cities in the Russian sense, no walls, no cathedral, no permanent market. Instead, there were nomadic camps, yurts, circular felt tents, clustered in patterns that could be dismantled and moved in a matter of hours. Herders moving enormous flocks of horses, sheep, cattle across the plains. A completely different way of life, shaped by completely different geography. And everywhere, Mongols. Not just soldiers, but entire families, entire tribes, children playing near yurts, women preparing kumis, fermented mare's milk, and cooking over open fires, men training horses or practicing archery. It was different civilization, no less sophisticated than Russian, just built on completely different foundations. Alexander's retinue attracted attention wherever it passed. Foreigners were rare in the steppe depths, and a Russian delegation was particularly notable. But there was no hostility. There was curiosity, careful assessment, but also surprising hospitality. The steppe code required travelers be treated with respect, fed, and protected, even when those travelers were technically from subjugated peoples. The journey took weeks. Distances on the steppe are deceptive, without obvious reference points, without landmarks, just undulating grasses extending endlessly. It's easy to lose sense of how far one has traveled or how much remains. They followed Mongol guides now who knew routes and water sources, who understood how to navigate land that to inexperienced eyes seemed completely uniform. And finally, they reached Batu Khan's camp. It wasn't a city in the conventional sense, but it also wasn't a simple camp. It was what the Mongols called an ordu, the Khan's mobile camp, administrative and military center of the Golden Horde. There were hundreds, perhaps thousands of yurts arranged in organized patterns. There were enormous corrals with tens of thousands of horses, the true wealth and power of nomadic society. There were guards patrolling, scribes working, merchants from dozens of different cultures trading, ambassadors from distant kingdoms awaiting audience. It was an empire's capital, just one that could move. Batu Khan's yurt was distinguishable not by size, though it was large, but by decoration and positioning. It stood at the camp's center, with banners and flags indicating its importance. Guards, Mongol warriors in lamella leather armor, with composite bows and curved swords, maintained constant watch. Alexander and his retinue were housed in designated yurts and instructed to wait. Mongol protocol was specific and inflexible. One didn't simply walk up to the Khan and request audience, one waited to be summoned. And while waiting, one was observed, assessed, measured. The wait lasted days. It wasn't exactly hostility, but also wasn't warm welcome. It was test of patience, of respect for protocol, of seriousness of intentions. Impatient or arrogant visitors demonstrated lack of understanding of power realities. Those who waited patiently demonstrated they understood their position. Alexander waited. During the days of waiting, he had opportunity to observe camp life. And what he saw was revealing. The Mongol Empire wasn't simply a horde of plundering barbarians, as European propaganda liked to portray. It was a sophisticated system of governance, brilliantly adapted to govern vast territory and diverse peoples. There were scribes maintaining meticulous records of tributes and resources. There was functioning postal system, the YAM, network of relay stations allowing messages to travel thousands of kilometers in days. There was diplomacy, ambassadors from China, Persia, even from distant Abbasid Caliphate, all negotiating treaties and trade agreements. There was religious tolerance, Nestorian Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, all openly practicing their faiths. It was empire built on pragmatic principles: extract tribute efficiently, maintain order, allow subjugated peoples to maintain their cultures as long as they didn't rebel. There was no interest in forced conversion or imposition of Mongol ideology, only in effective control and resource flow. And gradually, as Alexander observed and learned, his strategy for audience with Batu Khan solidified. He wouldn't argue from strength. Clearly, he had none relative to the Mongols. He wouldn't appeal to mercy. The Khan wasn't interested in weakness. Instead, he would present Novgorod as valuable asset to the empire, as source of regular and reliable tribute, as potential ally against Western threats, as principality that could serve Mongol interests better preserved and functional than destroyed. It was a sale, essentially, but a sale where the product was his people's survival. Finally, on the 5th day, the invitation came. Batu Khan would grant audience to the Prince of Novgorod. It was the moment Alexander had been preparing for since deciding to make this journey. And everything, Novgorod's future, his own life, the balance of power that would determine Russia's trajectory for centuries, would depend on what happened next. The meeting with the Khan, summer 1241. The interior of Batu Khan's yurt is unlike any throne room Alexander has ever seen. There's no elaborate stone, no stained glass, no golden icons on walls. Instead, there are richly colored carpets covering the floor, felts decorated with intricate patterns lining the circular walls, and an opening at the top allowing light and smoke to escape simultaneously. The air inside is perfumed with strange incense, not the incense of Orthodox churches Alexander is familiar with, but something more earthy, more exotic. There's also smell of leather and horses, the constant aromas of nomadic life. And underlying everything, there's atmosphere of concentrated power, the physical sensation of being in the presence of someone who commands tens of thousands of warriors and governs territory extending for thousands of kilometers. Batu Khan sits not on elevated throne, but in slightly elevated position on elaborate cushions. He's a middle-aged man, probably in his early 40s at this point, with characteristic Mongol features, dark, penetrating eyes, broad, strong face that has seen decades of military campaign, presence that communicates authority without need for ostentation. Around him are his generals and advisors, some Mongols, others from diverse peoples who have been incorporated into the empire. There are also scribes prepared to record what's said, and interpreters ready to translate between Mongol, Russian, and possibly other languages if necessary. Mongol protocol for audiences is specific and must be followed precisely. Alexander was previously instructed on what was expected. Approach respectfully. Don't make direct eye contact with the Khan until invited. Prostrate oneself as Mongol tradition requires of visitors. Wait for permission before speaking. Each of these gestures goes against Alexander's instincts as Russian prince, as leader who just won significant battle, as descendant of dynasty that ruled when Mongols were still obscure tribes in Asia's depths. But he executes them without hesitation, without visible signs of reluctance or resentment, because he understands what many leaders of his era didn't understand, that protocol isn't gratuitous humiliation, but language. That following appropriate forms communicates respect, understanding of power realities, and seriousness of intentions. That resisting protocol out of pride is confusing symbol with substance. There's prolonged silence after Alexander completes formal bows. It's another test of patience, of self-control, of ability to remain comfortable in discomfort. Insecure leaders feel need to fill silences with words. Confident leaders can wait. Alexander waits. Finally, through the interpreter, Batu Khan speaks. His voice is measured, controlled, carrying weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. The chronicles don't record the exact dialogue. What survived are later summaries and reconstructions based on results. But the conversation's essence can be inferred from resulting agreements and historical context. Batu Khan begins by acknowledging Alexander's victory over the Crusaders. It's not exactly praise. The Mongols don't see need to praise those they consider subordinates, but it's recognition. It's validation that the Khan is aware of Alexander's military competence, and that this has value. Then comes the crucial point. The Khan expresses expectation that Novgorod, like all other Rus' territories, will formally recognize Mongol sovereignty and pay regular tribute. It's not presented as request or negotiation, it's statement of reality. The question isn't whether Novgorod will submit, but on what terms this submission will be structured. This is where Alexander's preparation shows its value. He doesn't argue, doesn't protest, doesn't raise objections about injustice or Russian sovereignty or any other abstract principle. Instead, he acknowledges Mongol supremacy openly and completely, and then moves the conversation to practical details. How much tribute? In what form? Gold, silver, furs, other resources? How frequently? Through what collection mechanisms? Will there be Mongol governors residing in Novgorod, or will administration remain in Russian hands? What military obligations will Novgorod have? Providing troops for Mongol campaigns or simply maintaining order in its own territory? These are questions from subordinate to superior, not equal to equal. But they're practical questions that move discussion from abstract principle to concrete implementation. And in concrete implementation is where real autonomy can be preserved. The agreement that emerged, not immediately in this first audience, but through various discussions over days, establishes structure that will govern Novgorod-Mongol relations for the next decades. Novgorod formally recognizes Batu Khan as supreme suzerain. It will pay annual tribute in silver and furs, resources Novgorod can provide relatively easily given its trade network. Novgorod's prince will periodically travel to pay homage to the Khan, renewing recognition of vassalage. In exchange, Novgorod will maintain substantial autonomy in internal affairs. There will be no permanent Mongol garrisons in the city. Orthodox faith will be protected. The Mongols explicitly guarantee religious freedom, local institutions, the Vesh, the boyars, the unique structure of merchant republic will remain intact. Its submission, without doubt. But it's submission that preserves the essential while ceding what couldn't be defended anyway. It's the art of the possible practiced at the highest level. Curious, isn't it? Leave in the comments what you think about this. There's also a personal element to these negotiations that the chronicles only hint at but was probably crucial. Batu Khan is assessing Alexander not just as Novgorod's representative, but as individual, as potential ally or useful tool, as someone he can trust to implement Mongol policies in Western Rus. And Alexander is passing this assessment. His willingness to travel voluntarily eastward, to follow Mongol protocol without resistance, to negotiate pragmatically instead of posturing ideologically, all this communicates that he's the type of vassal the Mongol Empire values. Someone competent, realistic, focused on practical results instead of symbolic gestures. It's beginning of relationship that would shape the rest of Alexander's life. And through him, Russia's destiny. But there's complication that emerges during Alexander's stay at the Mongol camp. Complication that reveals as much about Mongol power's nature as about tensions within the empire. Batu Khan isn't final authority in the Mongol world. He governs the Golden Horde but is technically subordinate to the Great Khan in Karakorum, the Mongol Empire's capital in distant Mongolia. And in 1241 there are questions about succession and authority, creating political tensions throughout the entire empire. Some of Batu's advisors suggest Alexander should travel even further east, to Karakorum, to pay homage directly to the Great Khan. It's extraordinary demand that would involve journey of months through thousands of kilometers of unknown territory and could easily result in Alexander never returning. It's moment of real tension. If Alexander refuses, he might offend and suggest he doesn't take his obligations seriously enough. If he accepts, he might be condemning himself to months or years away from Novgorod, during which his political position could be undermined and his enemies could maneuver against him. The final decision, preserved in chronicles though details are fragmentary, seems to have been compromise. Alexander accepts in principle the obligation to eventually travel to Karakorum, but not immediately. He'll first return to Novgorod to implement agreements reached with Batu to ensure tribute is established and paid as promised. Then, at future date, the journey to the Deep East will be considered, its solution that allows everyone to save face. Batu demonstrated his authority by making the demand. Alexander demonstrated respect by accepting in principle. But implementation is postponed until circumstances allow. It's exactly the type of diplomatic ambiguity that allows agreements to be reached when positions are otherwise irreconcilable. After several weeks in Batu Khan's Ordu, weeks of formal audiences, ceremonial meals, observation of Mongol life and customs, and countless smaller conversations with various officials and generals, Alexander finally receives permission to depart. He leaves with formal documents. Yarliks, Mongol imperial decrees confirming reached agreements and guaranteeing imperial protection. These documents, written in Mongol and possibly other languages with imperial seals, are simultaneously certificates of submission and guarantees of autonomy. They're proof that Novgorod is now formally part of Mongol imperial system, but also protection against arbitrary demands from local governors or military commanders. The journey back is different from the journey there. Going, there was uncertainty and tension, knowledge that everything would depend on audience whose outcome was unpredictable. Returning, there's relief and satisfaction at success, but also weight of responsibility. Alexander negotiated agreement that saved Novgorod from destruction, but at price of recognizing formal submission to foreign power. He preserved substantial autonomy, but only within framework of vassalage. It's victory, but victory that required sacrifices some will never forgive. As the retinue travels back through the steppes, then through borderlands, finally back to familiar forests of northern Russes, Alexander has time to reflect on what he accomplished and what it means. He established pattern for how Russian principalities will interact with Mongol power for the next centuries. He demonstrated that submission needn't mean destruction of identity, that it's possible to bow without breaking, that survival is a legitimate form of victory. But he also created precedent. Other Russian principalities will follow, some voluntarily, others reluctantly. Russes will be, for the next generations, part of Mongol political system. Its princes will regularly travel east to renew their submissions. Its tribute will flow to Mongol coffers. Its policies will be influenced, if not determined, by considerations of how the Mongols will react. Its fundamental transformation. And Alexander, in his early 20s, is one of the principal architects of this transformation. When he finally reaches Novgorod in autumn 1241, after months absent, the reception is mixed. There's relief that he returned alive. There's recognition that he secured the city's survival through skillful diplomacy. But there's also disappointment among some that the hero of the battle on the ice bowed to the Mongols, paid tribute, recognized foreign suzerainty. Alexander faces these criticisms directly. In meetings with boyars, in speeches to the Vesh, in private conversations with religious leaders, he argues his case. The reality is brutal and simple. The alternative to negotiated submission he secured wasn't glorious independence, it was total destruction. Kiev tried to resist. Where is Kiev now? Vladimir, Ryazan, dozens of other cities tried to resist. How many still exist in significant form? Novgorod survives, its faith is protected, its institutions continue, its trade can be rebuilt, its children will grow up speaking Russian, worshipping in Orthodox churches, maintaining their ancestors' traditions. All this because Alexander had courage to do what was necessary, not what was proud. Would you do the same? Would you bow before overwhelming power to save your people, knowing some would call you coward? Or would you choose glorious and futile resistance, heroic but complete destruction? These aren't easy questions, and Alexander will face consequences of his choices for the rest of his life. But for now, in autumn 1241, Novgorod is safe. Immediate threats, both Western and Eastern, have been neutralized. There's peace, even if it's peace bought through submission. There's space to breathe, to rebuild, to look beyond mere survival. And Alexander, having demonstrated mastery in both war and diplomacy, having successfully navigated dangers of both battlefields and imperial courts, solidified his position as one of the most important leaders of his era. The foundation was established, the pattern was set, and through his choices, painful, pragmatic choices, oriented towards survival above glory, Alexander Nevsky shaped what Russia would become. But his story is far from over. There are still decades of governance ahead. There are still more journeys eastward. There are still internal and external challenges. There are still difficult choices that will test not just his competence, but his character. And through it all, he would maintain the impossible balance he established, strong enough not to be ignored, but not so strong as to be seen as threat. Submissive enough to satisfy the Mongols, but not so submissive as to lose his own people's respect. Russian in soul and faith, but Mongol in political alliance. It's contradiction, it's compromise, it's survival, and it worked. The weight of the crown. 1242–1252. A decade after the battle on the ice. Alexander Nevsky is no longer the young prince who surprised the world with bold victories. He's in his 30s now, hardened by years of governance, diplomacy, and the constant tensions of keeping Novgorod functioning within the Mongol imperial order. This decade is less dramatic than the years of battles, but in many ways more revealing of who Alexander really is. Because governing in times of peace, or at least in absence of open war, is different test than fighting on battlefields. It requires different patience, different skills, different tolerance for ambiguity and compromise. Implementation of agreements with the Golden Horde proves more complex than negotiating them. On paper, everything seemed clear. Novgorod would pay annual tribute, recognize Mongol supremacy, maintain order in its territory. In exchange, it would maintain internal autonomy and imperial protection. In practice, each of these terms is subject to interpretation, negotiation, and constant conflict. The question of tribute alone generates continuous tensions. How much exactly should be paid? Mongol demands sometimes seem arbitrary or excessive in Novgorod's eyes. The merchant boyars, accustomed to calculating every transaction to the last penny, resist what they see as extortion. The common population, already living close to subsistence margin in bad years, sees tribute as crushing burden. Alexander finds himself in the impossible position of having to extract resources from his own people to satisfy foreign lords. He has to be tax collector for empire many of his subjects detest. And when collection doesn't go smoothly, when there's resistance, when villages refuse to pay, when boyars hide resources, he has to be enforcer. Chronicles of this period record several episodes of internal tension. On some occasions, Alexander had to use force against his own people to ensure tribute was collected. Not because he wanted to, all evidence suggests he understood and sympathized with the burden tribute represented, but because the alternative was worse. If Novgorod didn't pay, the Mongols would come collect personally, and their collection wouldn't be gentle. It's moral dilemma Alexander faces repeatedly: cause lesser suffering to avoid much greater suffering, force his own people to pay to prevent them from being plundered, be the oppressor to avoid worse oppressors. Have you ever found yourself in a position where all choices are bad and you need to choose the least worst? Where doing the right thing in abstract sense would lead to disastrous consequences, so you do the pragmatic thing and carry the guilt. That's where Alexander lives now, and it's leaving marks. Relations with Novgorod's boyars are also constant source of tension. The city's unique republican structure means Alexander can't simply govern by decree. He needs to maintain at least enough support in the Vech and among the most powerful boyars to remain effective. But his policies, especially submission to the Mongols, aren't universally popular. There's faction that never forgave his decision to bow to the Mongols. They see it as betrayal, as weakness, as abandonment of Russian ideals. They'd prefer glorious resistance, even knowing it would mean destruction. For them, principles matter more than pragmatism. There's another faction supporting Alexander, but only while he delivers results. They're the pragmatists, the merchants, who value stability and functioning trade routes. But their support is conditional. If Alexander stops being useful, if economic situation worsens too much, if better alternative appears, they'll switch sides without hesitation. And there's smaller but vocal faction that secretly would prefer accommodation with Western powers. Catholic, yes, but at least European, at least Christian. For them, the Mongols represent Asia, paganism, something fundamentally foreign that can never be truly compatible with Russian identity. Alexander has to navigate between these factions constantly. He has to make alliances, make concessions, sometimes play one faction against another. It's exhausting political game with no clear finish line, just continuous maintenance of balance that could collapse at any moment, and there are his own periodic journeys eastward. Agreements with Batu Khan require Alexander travel regularly to renew his submission, to update the Khan on Novgorod's situation, to negotiate adjustments to tribute terms or other obligations. Each journey takes months. The journey alone consumes weeks in each direction, and time at the Mongol Ordu can extend depending on political considerations. During these absences, Novgorod is vulnerable. Boyars who resent Alexander have opportunity to consolidate power. Problems arise that can't be resolved without the prince's authority, and there's always possibility Alexander won't return, that something at the Mongol Ordu goes wrong, that he offends the Khan somehow, that imperial politics shift, and he becomes dispensable. But the journeys also serve crucial purpose. They keep Alexander informed about developments in the Mongol world. They allow him to build relationships with Mongol officials who might be valuable later, and they demonstrate to the Mongols that he's loyal and reliable vassal, which buys Novgorod some tolerance and flexibility. It's investment in political capital that might not seem productive in short term, but pays dividends over time. During this decade, there's also development that will fundamentally change the political landscape. The death of Batu Khan in 1255-1256. Sources differ on exact date. Power transitions in authoritarian states are always moments of danger and opportunity. The Khan's death means all previous agreements need to be reconfirmed with the new ruler. It means different factions within the Golden Horde might fight for power. It means uncertainty. Alexander navigates this transition with the same mixture of pragmatism and diplomacy characterizing all his governance. He travels again eastward to pay homage to the new Khan, to reconfirm Novgorod's agreements, to ensure continuity. It's ritual that reaffirms submission, but also secures stability. There are also, during these years, recurring threats from the west. The Teutonic Knights, though defeated at Lake Peipus, haven't disappeared. They continue pressuring neighboring territories, trying to expand their influence, looking for opportunities to reverse their losses. Alexander has to maintain constant vigilance, keep defenses prepared, occasionally respond to minor incursions. But now there's crucial difference. Alexander can, when necessary, invoke Mongol imperial protection. He can threaten, delicately, diplomatically, but effectively, that aggression against Novgorod is aggression against territory under the Khan's protection. And this threat has real weight. The Teutonics can defeat Novgorod. They can't defeat the Mongol Empire. Its irony some in Novgorod appreciate and others resent. Submission to the Mongols provides protection against Western threats. Loss of formal independence buys practical security. During this decade also there are changes in Alexander's family. He marries, sources aren't completely clear about exact timing and even about his wife or wife's identity. Genealogical records of medieval Rus are frustratingly incomplete. He has children who will eventually govern territories of their own. He's establishing dynasty, creating continuity, thinking beyond his own life. And he's aging. Not dramatically, or where he's only in his 30s, but he's feeling the weight of years of tension, of difficult travels, of impossible decisions. There's less energy now, more careful calculation, less boldness, and more pragmatism. The Alexander of this period isn't the youth who charged at the Neva or danced on ice at Lake Peipus. He's administrator, diplomat, manager of complexities. It's less exciting, less heroic in conventional sense, but it's in many ways more important. Because battles decide moments, governance decides centuries, and Alexander's governance during this decade, with all its concessions and compromises, all its morally ambiguous decisions, all its skillful navigation between irreconcilable powers, is establishing patterns Russia will follow long after he's gone. He's teaching Russian principalities how to survive under foreign rule without losing identity, how to bow without breaking, how to be vassal in politics but remain Russian in soul. It's a lesson Russia will need to learn repeatedly throughout its history. And Alexander Nevsky is the first great teacher, but there's personal cost. The weight of maintaining this balance, of making these impossible choices, of carrying responsibility for thousands of lives is exhausting him. Chronicles don't record his private thoughts or moments of doubt. We don't have that intimacy with medieval figures, but we can infer from evidence of his actions and stress patterns that leadership of this magnitude imposes. He became what his time and circumstances demanded, not necessarily what he might have wished to be, but what was necessary. Neither pure victim nor pure hero, simply human, doing his best in impossible situation. And as the 1240s turn into the 1250s, as Alexander approaches what will be the final years of his life, challenges don't diminish. They just evolve. New tensions emerge. New crises demand attention. New balance needs to be maintained. The work of keeping Novgorod alive, of keeping Russian identity intact under Mongol rule, of navigating between East and West, between submission and autonomy, between principle and pragmatism, this work never ends until it does, abruptly, permanently, the way life always ends. But that part of the story is still to come. The Last Journey, 1263. Alexander Nevsky is 42 years old. By medieval standards, that's not young. Life expectancy for someone of his social class and era, assuming survival through childhood and avoiding violent death, is perhaps 50 to 60 years, but many don't come close. And Alexander has lived life that ages men quickly. Decades of tension, of grueling travels, of decisions carrying the weight of thousands of lives. He's tired, not just physically, though that too, but that deep weariness that comes from carrying impossible responsibilities for too long, from making choices no one should have to make, from maintaining balance that always seems on the verge of collapse. And now, in summer 1263, he must make one more journey eastward, one more journey to the Golden Horde, one more renewal of submission, one more round of negotiations about tribute and obligations. It's ritual he's executed several times over the past 2 decades. But this time, for reasons he can't fully articulate, it feels different. It feels final. The situation precipitating this specific journey is complex but familiar. The Mongols are demanding not just tribute in resources, but also recruitment of Russian soldiers for their campaigns. It's escalation in demands that several Russian principalities are resisting. And where there's resistance, there's potential for Mongol violence, for punitive expeditions, for examples being made. Alexander, as senior figure among Russian princes and as someone with decades of relationship with the Golden Horde, is called to mediate, to travel eastward and negotiate terms that will be acceptable both to the Mongols and to Russian principalities, to once again walk that impossible line between submission that satisfies lords and autonomy that keeps vassals tolerable. He departs Novgorod knowing the journey will be difficult. It's late summer, which means he'll travel through autumn and possibly into winter. Roads will be in increasingly poor condition. Weather will become increasingly brutal. And his own body, after decades of such travels, is no longer as resilient as it was at 20, but he goes anyway, because it's what he's always done, because it's what his position demands. Because if he doesn't go, someone less skilled in Mongol diplomacy will, and the result could be disastrous for all Russian principalities. The story is coming to an end, but what comes next is the most reflective part. Stay with me. The journey across the steppes in autumn has melancholic beauty. The grasses, green and alive in summer, are now golden and dry. The sky seems bigger somehow, more vast, as if the horizon itself were expanding. There's constant wind, always wind on the steppes, carrying smell of dry earth and changing season. Alexander travels with smaller retinue this time. Not the elaborate formal delegation of his first visits to the Mongol Ordu, but more functional group of advisors, guards and assistants. Men who've made this journey before, who know the rituals and dangers. As they travel deeper into Mongol territory, Alexander feels something changing within him. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but as gradual recognition. His body isn't cooperating as it should. There's fever coming and going. There's weakness that isn't just travel fatigue. There are signs a man of his experience recognizes as problematic. But he continues. Because stopping now, turning back, would waste the journey and leave problems unresolved. Better to complete the mission than rest. They reach the Golden Horde's Ordu, now not Batu's, who died years before, but his successors who continue administering this vast empire within empire. The physical structure is familiar, the yurts, the horse corrals, the organized layout that can be dismantled and moved, but at this moment seems as permanent as any city. The negotiations that follow are technically successful. Alexander, using decades of experience in Mongol diplomacy, manages to moderate recruitment demands. He doesn't eliminate them. The Mongols don't yield completely, but reduces them to levels Russian principalities can bear without breaking. It's compromise, as always. It's not perfect victory, but it's better than alternative, but the effort costs. The formal audiences, court rituals, hours of careful negotiation in foreign language through interpreters, all this exhausts Alexander in ways previous travels didn't. The fever worsens. The weakness deepens. And when time comes to depart, to make the long journey back to Novgorod, Alexander knows, with that terrible certainty that sometimes comes at the end, that he won't make it. He leaves anyway. Because the alternative is dying here, in foreign territory, far from home. And if he must die, he'd rather at least try to get closer to home. The return journey is a nightmare of growing discomfort and failing consciousness. There are moments of lucidity where Alexander is fully present, aware of his situation, making decisions about route and stops. And there are moments where fever takes him, where time and space become confused, where past and present mix. They stop at Gorodets, a small city on the Volga, still far from Novgorod but farther from the steppe. And here, in wooden structure serving as princely residence, surrounded by some of the men who accompanied him on decades of travels, Alexander Nevsky dies. The date is generally given as November 14th, 1263, though as always with medieval sources there's some uncertainty, but the essential fact is unquestionable. The man who saved Novgorod, who defeated Crusaders on ice, who navigated impossible diplomacy with Mongol Empire, who shaped what Russia would become. This man is dead at 42. Chronicles record that in final moments, Alexander took monastic vows, becoming monk in Orthodox order, common practice among Russian princes facing death, form of spiritual preparation for what comes after. Whether he was conscious enough for this to be genuine choice, or whether it was ritual executed by others in his name, we don't know. But symbolism was important. Alexander would die not just as prince, but as brother in faith. News of his death travels slowly, as all news in medieval era. But when it reaches Novgorod, the impact is profound. The Orthodox Church's metropolitan supposedly proclaimed, "My children, know that the sun of the land of Suzdal has set." It was recognition that not just man, but era was unrecoverable. Alexander's body is transported back, not to Novgorod, where he ruled, but to Vladimir, where there's important monastery and where princely burial is appropriate. The body's journey takes weeks, and along the way there are reports of people coming out from villages and cities to pay respect, to see past the man who had become legend even in life. The funeral in Vladimir is grand, with all the pomp Orthodox Church and princely tradition demand. Bells toll, incense perfumes the air, prayers are chanted in Old Slavonic, and Alexander is buried in the monastery of the Nativity of the Virgin, in place that will become pilgrimage for future generations. But Alexander's true legacy isn't in his tomb, it's in what he left behind, in patterns he established, in choices he made, in direction he helped push Russian history. He demonstrated it was possible to maintain Russian identity under foreign rule, that political submission needn't mean cultural destruction, that sometimes bowing is form of resistance, that waiting is form of fighting, that survival is form of victory. These aren't lessons that satisfy idealists or romantics. These aren't stories of pure heroism or unbreakable principles. They're lessons of pragmatism, compromise, moral ambiguity. They're lessons recognizing that in a world of empires and overwhelming power, the weak don't have luxury of moral purity. They have only choices between evils and wisdom to choose lesser evils. The Russian principalities under Mongol rule, what historians call the Tatar yoke period, would last more than 2 centuries after Alexander's death. Throughout that time, patterns he established would remain relevant. Russian princes would travel eastward to pay homage. Tribute would flow to Mongol coffers, but Orthodox faith would survive. Russian language would survive. Russian traditions, adapted but not destroyed, would continue. And when finally, in late 15th century, Russia emerged from Mongol rule, when Ivan III declared independence and began building what would become Russian Empire, Alexander Nevsky's memory would be invoked. He'd be canonized as saint by Orthodox Church. He'd be celebrated as national hero. His name would be given to military orders, to cathedrals, to cities. But perhaps more significantly, he'd be remembered not just for his military victories, though those are impressive, but for his strategic wisdom, for his understanding that sometimes the greatest act of leadership is knowing when not to fight, when to bow, when to survive. It's lesson Russia would need to learn repeatedly throughout its long and often tragic history. Lesson about resilience, adaptation, survival through impossible circumstances, and it all began with 20-year-old on Misty River, choosing to attack when prudence would counsel retreat. And it ended with 42-year-old man dying on journey made not for glory, but for preservation. To keep his people alive one more year, one more decade, one more generation. It's not story Hollywood would make. There's no triumphant ending, no clear victory, no moment where hero conquers everything. It's just man doing his best in impossible circumstances, making choices that will leave some loving him and others hating him, and then dying before seeing if his choices really worked long term. But these are the real stories. Not the clean and simple ones, but the messy and ambiguous ones. Stories where heroes are flawed, where victories come with costs, where doing the right thing often seems indistinguishable from doing the pragmatic thing. And perhaps that's why Alexander Nevsky's story remains relevant 8 centuries after his death, because it's a story about universal human dilemmas, about choices between principles and survival, about leadership in impossible times, about cost of saving what you love. These are questions every generation faces in new ways, and the answers Alexander gave, imperfect, controversial, but effective, still have something to teach us. Echoes through the centuries. Alexander Nevsky's story ended on that road between the steppes and home in a small city on the Volga's banks on a November day in 1263. But the waves his life created continued propagating through centuries, touching shores he could never have imagined. It's strange to think about, isn't it? How one man's choices, made in specific moments, under specific pressures, in a world that no longer exists, can reverberate through generations that will come centuries later. How decisions made in Mongol yurt or on lake ice can shape the destiny of nations not yet born. But that's exactly what happened. In centuries after Alexander's death, Russia continued its precarious existence under Mongol rule. Patterns he established, pragmatic submission combined with preservation of cultural identity, became model for survival. Russian princes learned the art Alexander had mastered, bowing without breaking, paying tribute while preserving faith and language, waiting patiently for a moment when power would shift, and power always shifts. Empires that seem eternal crumble. Conquerors who seem invincible are conquered in turn. The Mongol Empire, vast as it was, eventually fragmented into smaller khanates, then declined, then disappeared as significant political force. And when that happened, Russia was still there. Weakened, transformed, but fundamentally intact. Speaking Russian. Worshipping in Orthodox churches. Maintaining memory of who they were before Mongol invasion. This wouldn't have been possible without choices Alexander and leaders like him made. If they had chosen heroic and futile resistance, as Kiev did, as so many other cities did, Russia, as cultural identity, might have disappeared completely. Might have been just historical footnote, memory of people who existed briefly before being swallowed by larger empire. But it survived, and in late 15th century, when Moscow emerged as new center of Russian power, when Ivan III declared independence from weakened remnants of Golden Horde, it was rebirth, not birth. It was continuation of something that had been preserved through centuries of subjugation. And in that moment of national rebirth, Alexander Nevsky's memory was invoked. He was canonized as saint, not just for miracles attributed to him, though there were stories, as there always are, but for something deeper, for having saved not just lives, but identity, for having understood that sometimes survival is form of resistance. His feast was established in Orthodox calendar. Churches were dedicated to him. His name became symbol of something fundamental in Russian consciousness, the idea that Russia can be knocked down but not destroyed, can be occupied but not eliminated, can seem defeated but always returns. What a journey, isn't it? If you enjoyed traveling with us, consider subscribing to the channel for more stories like this. And if you have any reflections, share them in the comments. In following centuries, Russian rulers of all eras would invoke Alexander Nevsky when they needed symbol of resistance and survival. Peter the Great moved his relics to St. Petersburg, creating connection between medieval saint and modern imperial ambitions. Catherine the Great established Order of Alexander Nevsky, one of empire's highest honors. During World War II, when Soviet Union faced Nazi invasion, Stalin, who had spent decades suppressing religion, revived Alexander Nevsky's memory as symbol of defense against Western invaders. Its political use of historical figure, certainly. And in some cases it distorts or simplifies complex reality of who Alexander really was and what he did. But it also speaks to something genuine, to human need for stories that teach us how to survive the impossible, how to maintain identity when everything conspires to erase it, how to make difficult choices in impossible times. And these needs are universal. They're not just Russian. They're not just medieval. Every people at some point faces existential crises, moments where survival is at stake, where abstract principles confront brutal reality, where leaders must choose between glory leading to destruction and compromise leading to survival. And in those moments, Alexander Nevsky's story offers lesson. Not necessarily the lesson everyone wants to hear, because it's not a story of pure heroism or unbreakable principles, but it's lesson of practical wisdom, of understanding that courage sometimes means knowing when not to fight, that strength sometimes means flexibility, that victory sometimes looks very much like defeat to outside observers, but for those who survive, it's victory enough. Think of Alexander's own journey. It begins with 20-year-old bold enough to attack Swedish force in morning mist. It continues through battle on ice, moment of tactical genius that would enter legend. But then it transforms into something different, into decades of patient diplomacy, of exhausting travels eastward, of endless negotiations, of collecting taxes from his own people to pay foreign lords, of making choices some of his contemporaries saw as betrayal. It's not narrative arcs satisfying conventional heroism expectations. There's no climactic moment where everything resolves in triumphant glory. It's just man doing what was necessary day after day, year after year, until he couldn't anymore, and then he died in obscure city, on journey made not for glory but for administration, without knowing if his choices would really work long-term, without seeing Russia eventually emerge from Mongol rule. Without knowing he'd be remembered as saint and national hero, he just did the work and trusted it would be enough. There's something deeply comforting in that, isn't there? In the idea that we don't need to see final results of our actions for them to have meaning. That doing our best in impossible circumstances is enough, even if we don't know how the story ends. We all live in our own impossible moments. Perhaps not as dramatically medieval, perhaps not involving empires and armies, but impossible nonetheless, moments where we must choose between bad options, where principles confront pragmatism, where what's right isn't clear, and we must do our best with incomplete information and contradictory pressures. And in those moments, perhaps there's solace in knowing others went through this before. That moral ambiguity we feel isn't our failure but human condition, that making difficult choices doesn't make us weak or compromised, but simply human, trying to navigate complex reality. Alexander Nevsky wasn't perfect. He made decisions we can question. He made compromises we might disapprove of. He served a system that oppressed his people. But within limitations of his time and circumstances, he did what he believed necessary to preserve what mattered most. And in the end, it worked. Not perfectly, not without cost, but sufficiently. Russia survived. Orthodox faith survived. Russian language and culture survived. And centuries later, when those survivors looked back, seeking to understand how they got where they were, they found Alexander Nevsky's figure, imperfect, controversial, but undeniably significant, standing at history's crossroads. As night deepens and this story comes to end, as you prepare for sleep, perhaps you can take one thing from this journey through medieval Rus. Not necessarily answers, because Alexander's situations were his and ours are ours, but perhaps question, perhaps reflection. What's worth preserving? What are we willing to compromise to protect what truly matters? How do we balance principles and pragmatism? How do we know when to fight and when to bow? There are no easy answers. There never were. Not even for saint and national hero. Just difficult choices and hope that in the end, they'll have been right choices. And now, as sleep approaches, as day's concerns fade, perhaps we can rest, knowing others faced impossible before us, that they did their best, that they survived, and that their stories, told 8 centuries later in language they didn't know to people in world they couldn't imagine, still have something to teach us about courage, survival, and cost of saving what we love. Good night, and thank you for traveling with us through this story of ice and diplomacy, of battles and compromises, of one man who saved his people by understanding when to bow and when to rise. May you rest well, and may tomorrow you face your own impossible choices with wisdom that comes from knowing you're not alone, that others walked difficult paths before, and that survival sometimes is the greatest victory of all.